This video will contain spoilers for Deltarune chapters 3 and 4. You have been warned.
Oh, Kris, it looks like you're getting a call on your phone. Here, let me answer it for you. Oh, poop! Kris, whatever you do, don't pick up that phone.
Hey! It's me! WD Gaster! Like the Game Master!
What an amazing performance, folks, from our little masked fellow. The little star truly finds his way onto TV, even though this is aired to the internet. But enough of that. We have a game to play. And I see some wonderful contestants right in front of my very eyes. So let's get that brain churning with a good old-fashioned quiz. Say it with me, folks. First question. Fakey did a poll on his channel for the most favorite chapter in Deltarune. Which chapter was voted the most? That is correct. I knew you all were stars the moment you turned on that TV. But the real stars were the ones that voted for chapter 3. Next question. What was the first ever video posted to this channel?
It's me, your Gru.
What a video and a title. Though I don't fully understand the meaning, but I can tell that this was a great video to start off with. Now is time for your final question. Who is the person that has given you this quiz? That is me, your most favorite of hosts, Mr. Ante.
Alright, I know. I'm not Tenna. I'm not even 3D. You'll just have to deal with my little Tenna theory sona that I got going on here. Cause today, it is finally time. The moment you've all been waiting for. The release of Deltarune chapters 3 and 4. The new chapters blew me away with everything that it had to offer, and I feel like it absolutely destroyed mine and I feel like everyone else's understanding of what the direction the game is actually going to take, which only helped to richen the experience of these new chapters for me. Having everything new and fresh right in front of my very eyes was an absolutely magical experience. So why don't I break down my thoughts, do a thorough analysis of these new chapters, and explain some of the important lore that we've learned, along with my own little theories that I got. So why don't we start off with the chapter that got hinted about the most, and the chapter that has the one, the only TV star himself. Let us begin the long-awaited chapter 3 of Deltarune. Chapter 3 was such a very different chapter in comparison to every other chapter that we have, including chapter 4. And you can immediately tell this fact from the long-awaited antagonist of the chapter, Tenna. Seeing Tenna for the first time left me flabbergasted. I didn't think it was actually him. I thought this must have been a fake Tenna or something. But no, Tenna is our first character in Deltarune to use a 3D model for their sprites, in a very similar way to the old Donkey Kong Country games on the SNES. And I'll go more into his character in a little bit, but this chapter actually starts off with a plot point I didn't really expect. Susie is hit with the cold, hard facts that Ralsei and every other Darkner that she has made friends with are not real. During this sequence, we also get some very interesting imagery. A small room populated only by a single chair, a bed, and a poster. This room is heavily implied to be Susie's room, a very stark contrast to the room that she has in Castletown. And Ralsei says something very, very interesting, wink wink. He says, what if it could get darker than dark? Ralsei describes a darkness that leads to another side, one where we can see things again, hear things, and feel them. And in this description, we get to see our good old buddy, image_friend, having a body that sort of resembles a cat-like version of Endogamy from Undertale. All right, so already there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, Friend is now confirmed to be a cat, an idea many predicted when we first got that second wave of the Spamton sweepstakes, but now it is officially confirmed. Secondly, the line "darker than dark" is a direct quote from the Spamton sweepstakes page on the same chair that is within this Dark World introductory sequence. So in hindsight, it looks like that page itself was sort of hinting at this introductory sequence the entire time. Lastly, this line, "darker than dark," is very similar to Gaster's entry 17 line, "darker yet darker," which could reinforce the idea that Ralsei has a connection to Gaster in some way. After this sequence, Tenna, the ruler of the TV world, takes our heroes through his game show, one which starts out with a game Tenna has set up, a game that has a set path to follow, one that is all according to Tenna's plan. This video game is a very clear reference to the old 2D Legend of Zelda games, and would explain why Toby Fox quoted a Zelda line in the new Spamton sweepstake pages. But after beating this first round, we get to wait and chill out in this green room. And it actually is kind of surreal actually being able to play the green room area after having it being teased for so many years. But this area is where we get access to the different ranked rooms, one of which leads to a very interesting set of events. But round 2 starts and everything is pretty standard, very similar to the previous round. However, at the end of the final physical challenge, it seems to be relating to December Holiday. Tenna even mentions her by name before beginning this Guitar Hero segment, and the song that we play, "Raise Up Your Bat," seems to be a direct reference to Des. And the lyrics in "Raise Up Your Bat" seems to give us more insight into December Holiday. Here, let me read them out to you. "When the demon heart is crying and the blood is gushing bright, raise up your bat for the burning fight. When your hope is slowly dying and your future's lost its rights, raise up your bat and face the fright. Let's knock 'em dead into the night. Come follow me into the dark, with your heart as the arc, which shall shine you the way, because I'm with you in the dark, with your heart as my mark, which shall guide you the way through the waves." Alright, let's analyze this. The word "waves" definitely tells to me that these lyrics at least seem to reflect an experience Des had within a Dark World. Dark Worlds in general seem to have a lot of ocean and water-like imagery tied to them. And with the lines, "with your heart as the arc and your heart as my mark," this seems to relate to the soul, more specifically Kris's soul, which sort of implies that Des and Kris had this Dark World experience together. And the whole song is about fighting and blood gushing bright, quote unquote, which means that this experience wasn't a very fun one, at least not in the traditional Chapter 1, Chapter 2 Dark World sense. And just another interesting last thing to know is it shares a line with "Don't Forget," being "I'm with you in the dark." Perhaps Des is supposed to be the character singing "Don't Forget." But after the second round, Tenna keeps trying to get the game to continue, but Susie and the Fun Gang aren't really having it and try to go tell Tenna that this will be the last round. But we overhear Tenna talking behind everyone's back to someone on Tenna's radio waves. I mean, it's not like a phone call, but it basically acts like a phone call, so I'm just gonna say it's a phone call. But the interesting thing with this is that afterwards, Susie tells us and all the characters in the room that the one thing that pisses her off the most is when people are not telling her the whole truth, which will come up later in Chapter 4, and most definitely will come up later in the game when Susie is told about Kris and their deal with the soul. But the Fun Gang decides to sort of explore the area without Tenna watching them to find a way out of this game show. And to do this, they enter a room with a parental lock on it. This room sets up an entirely different atmosphere compared to the TV world that we've gotten so far. Susie describes this as a cold room, and in order to progress, you need to enter different passcodes. The final one being 1, 2, 1225 or 1225, Christmas Day, a December holiday. And these codes open doors that have Toriel's face on top of them. What lies beyond all these locked doors is actually Toriel herself, trapped inside of a capsule by Tenna, in which Tenna calls his trump card. However, the FANGAME is found by Tenna, and we were sent to the Doom board, where later on we were able to escape and get one of the best sections in chapter 3, at least for me. Finally exploring the TV world in full while sneaking away from Tenna. And the music that plays during this section, oh, it's just so big. TV world is a certified bop. We even get that little cowboy section that Toby teased about in the Spamton sweepstakes. However, it seems that this section isn't the same as the original idea that Toby had planned, seeing as how we don't ever see these standing sprites for Susie and Kris. Along with some other scrap content, it implies that this was originally going to be more than what we got, which again, in hindsight, puts into perspective Toby saying in danger of being canceled, because it wasn't fully canceled, but we definitely didn't get the full picture. However, after going through this entire section, you come back to the green room and everything looks to have changed visually, almost to look like snow in a sort of way. And some of the TV darkeners have started to turn to stone. This sort of contradicts what Ralsei told us in chapter 2, saying that darkeners that come from a different world might not belong if they go to another. But in this case, the TV darkeners that originate from this world are churning to stone. You would think the Pippins would be the ones turning the stone, the ones that came from the card castle, not the Zappers. We get our final confrontation with Tenna, where we get a flashback to the olden times, the past, where everyone would watch Tenna in the living room. Toriel, Asgore, Kris, Azriel, Rudy, Carol, Noelle, and December. So yeah, we finally get an official sprite of Des. You know, it is silhouetted and it isn't the current Des in present day, but hey, it's something, and that is a win. And Tenna tells us that he was told by the Roaring Knight that if he kept the FANGAME busy, he could get back his audience, just like how he did back in the olden days. And you know, since we're talking about Tenna and his backstory, why don't I just go over his character a little bit, because I absolutely love it. If you couldn't tell from the Tenna Sona. Tenna is a man stuck in the past. He desperately tries to go back to the olden days, the time when all the eyes were on him. That's why he's so desperate for Kris's approval throughout the entirety of chapter 3, so desperate for them to smile again. But Kris never smiles, no matter how much Tenna tries and tries. Obviously, Tenna is sort of a parallel to Spamton's story, and through Tenna's dialogue, we know that they used to actually work together. However, the one thing that seemingly separates the two of them is that one had a special connection that offered Spamton hidden knowledge. But Tenna was unaware of who this person was the entire time and could never escape being left behind by everyone that he ever knew. That's why, in an act of desperation, Tenna took the knight's deal. And when it looks like Tenna is on his last legs and the FANGAME are about to leave him behind again by sealing the fountain, he gets desperate. That's why he has to go toe-to-toe with the FANGAME. And one of the most amazing boss fights of all time. We get to see all the mini games that we had before and some new ones in this sort of WarioWare type fight, and it's just so peak. One of the funnest boss fights I think I've ever played in a video game, and it just makes me hope in the future that we can get a boss rush mode, because these experiences are too much fun to not have them be easily replayable. But after we defeat Tenna, the coolest of sequences happens. The introduction of the Roaring Knight. And the Knight deserves its own section, but let me just say this for now. Nobody expected to get the Roaring Knight reveal in chapter 3, and my jaw literally dropped. What? This is why I love Deltarune so much, for surpassing my expectations every single chapter. And we get to go face to face with this Roaring Knight, and it is a very hard fight. And after you lose this fight, the Knight tries to take Toriel away or do something with this beam, but Susie is able to buy enough time for Undyne to appear in the Dark World. However, the Knight seizes the opportunity to take Undyne instead, and are able to to escape out of the dark world into the light world. They're able to do this because of the door that Kris opened at the end of chapter 2. So Susie and Kris sort of chase the knight out of the house, but the knight is able to escape into the shelter below, locking the steel door behind them. The shelter is now basically confirmed to house a dark fountain, with the darkness bubbling out of the doors before it closes. Susie, in frustration, starts banging on the door of the shelter, and a keypad is revealed. It has 3 symbols next to 3 input fields. 1 a pine tree, 1 a police badge, and 1 the symbol of the Deltarune. Susie, however, realizing that Toriel is still in danger and the dark fountain needs to be sealed, runs back to the house, and Kris just stands there. And as they stand, the shelter door opens up, and that's where chapter 3 seemingly ends. But that ain't all with chapter 3, because chapter 3 has many secrets to discuss, because a dark world made in Kris's very own home has a lot to say about their character and the past. So why don't we go back to those ranked rooms that I talked about earlier. One of the most bizarre secrets that you can get pretty early on is related to this gumball machine in the B rank room. By entering 1225, the same numbers on the parental lock, into the machine, Kris will be left by themselves. The background will have a blue tint to it, and a door will open up in the gumball machine. By going through the gumball machine, you're able to enter into an area with a red path that sort of weaves in various directions. However, Kris can seemingly walk out of bounds of this path, and the song Find Her is played in the background. The exact same song found in the Spamton sweepstakes all those years ago. Eventually, if you walk far enough, you come across a small blue gumball machine. When interacting with it, it says, "You used the machine. The capsule came out. Inside was something like hard lacquer. It was a small, dark triangle. You tried to take it, but it slipped through your hand, and you couldn't find it anymore. You couldn't find your hand." Afterwards, you're transported back to the B rank room, but the gumball machine is gone. So obviously, this is directly related to death. The 1225 and the Find Her song very clearly signifies that to us. However, this lacquer-like object in the shape of a triangle and seen through your hand sort of reminds me a lot of a shadow crystal. The first text with the shadow crystal that you get says, "You looked through the glass. For some reason, for just a brief moment, you thought you saw through your hand," which parallels this lacquer triangle, because after you pick it up, you can't find your hand anymore, almost like it's see-through. Now, I don't believe that this little triangle thing, or whatever the substance it's made out of, is exactly a shadow crystal. The glass-like imagery that we associate with shadow crystal seems to go against this hard lacquer triangle. However, the evidence linking it to shadow crystals still exist in some way. And there's something later on that we can get that sort of signifies what this object might exactly be. Anyway, moving on, probably the thing that you've been the most eager about to hear in chapter 3 is the sword route of the game. So let me give a full detailed analysis and explanation of this route, because there is a lot going on here, and it seems to tie directly into the themes of the game, as well as our characters' paths and their backstory. So, by getting an S rank, Z rank, or by paying 1,500 points, you can get access to the original video game, the one that Tenna based his game show off of. And we were able to access this video game because of this one Darkner, Ram. So why don't we talk about Ram a little bit, because Ram as a character is very intriguing to me. Ram is the power strip that was originally in the library that got taken by Kris into the Dreamer household. And and as such never really fitted into the TV Dark World. Ram also talks about how Kris and a girl used to play with various objects within the living room. These objects would be the laptop, which is Queen, and all the software and emails that are on with her, like Spampton, the playing cards like King and Jevil, and the TV watching it all being Tenna. Ram was included with these items and was treated as a toy by Kris. This is why Ram believes that he knows Kris best and always tries to have their best interest in heart, and is why Ram believes that Kris made the Dark Fountain in the first place to sort of recapture this past of playing make-believe with their items. So Ram believes that Kris doesn't really want to play tennis games, you know, this straight pathway from A to B. What Kris wants is freedom, real choices, a game where your choices do matter, and that's why Ram encourages Kris to play this original game. However, at the end of the Dark World, since Ram was from the library, even though he was cared for just as much as any other Darkners in this world, he was still turned to stone, an object that never really had a chance to fit in within the TV Dark World. The Pippin next to Ram at the end even says, "No one will shed a tear for him," which is a line that we first heard in the second wave of Spampton sweepstake pages. And it's like, Toby, what do you mean nobody will shed a tear for him? Because Ram's story is so sad. He just wanted to be cared for and thought he was doing his best for his friend. I mean, I'm shedding a tear for him, and I don't think I'm the only one shedding a tear for him. I think many fans had the same reaction to me. All right, so let's dissect this a little bit. So it looks like that the theory that people came up with in the chapter 1 era of the game, where Susie and Kris were just sort of playing make-believe the entire time, was actually kind of right. Because even though the Dark Worlds themselves aren't just like a fantasy make-believe in Kris and Susie's head, Kris did used to play with these objects in the past, which has sort of seemed to shape the Darkners and the Dark World's history that we explore in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and could have possibly influenced the personalities that these Darkners would have been given, because it's the personalities that were given to them when Kris and this girl was playing make-believe. Okay, but who is this girl that Kris played make-believe with? To me, it seems like there are two options. The first one being Noelle. You know, Kris and Noelle are the same age, and Queen does seem to have a lot of knowledge about Noelle, which would make sense if she was an object being played with Kris and Noelle very often. However, the other option that I could see is this girl being Des. This is because the playing cards that Kris and this girl used to play with are from the classroom that Des would have been a student in. Not to mention, Des seems to have a strong connection to the Chapter 3 Dark World in general, almost like she was here often, playing with these Darkners. However, it's nothing conclusive on who this girl specifically is, but I just wanted to throw it out there. But Ram's whole character sort of fits perfectly with what we would have associated with a secret boss back in the Chapter 2 era of Deltarune. He is an object that was sort of left to the wayside and seeks out freedom in some sort of way. In Ram's case, he seeks out freedom for Kris, and Kris being able to make their own choices within this sword video game. But maybe Ram's will wasn't strong enough, or because maybe the fountain wasn't created by the Roaring Knight itself, Ram never ended up being a secret boss and was left behind. However, what he did leave us was this sword game. So let's take a deeper look into it. So to use this hidden game in the first place, you need to use an odd controller found within the next room. The description of this game controller says, a gamepad no one wanted to use. The buttons are an ugly pink and yellow. The colors of pink and yellow are obviously a reference to both Spampton and image_friend. And the fact that it's an odd controller could also be a reference to the knockoff controller found underneath Azrael's bed in the Light World. So far, very strange connections to the controller. So we boot up this game for the first time, and we see the red soul, as slowly but surely it is taken over by the game, and we play as Kris. The map that this game takes place in is identical to the one from Tenna's Board 1 from his own game show. However, this time it is populated by enemies. These enemies within the game seem to directly reference Undertale characters. You have a blue fish with one eye being visible, which references Undyne and her eye patch, a yellow lizard being Alphys, a golden flower representing Flowey, and these horned monsters, which seem to resemble the shape of Asgore and Toriel's head. But we also get to see a bird enemy, which clearly points to Birdly as a character. And in order to progress in this game, you need to go down underground and find a sword. After getting the sword, Kris is able to kill these enemies and gain more and more levels to get themselves stronger. This sort of sequence is very similar to Undertale's genocide route, where you have to grind out levels and experience from monsters until there's nobody that remains. After getting the max level within this game, you're able to cut down the trees that would originally block your path. If you go down a certain path and cut the tree blocking a bridge on the left-hand side, you enter a room with a bunch of stairs that leads down to an empty room. However, if you walk forward, a shadowy entity flies up past the wall, like it was trying to blend in with the floor. And just barely, you're able to make out this text that reads, "See you soon," a message left by whatever this entity was. And if you go all the way back to the first part of the game where you spawn in and enter the room that would have Tenna's shop, darkened text reads, "Having fun?" Most likely left by the very same entity from earlier. After walking right from exiting the shop, you're able to cut down a tree and enter a very similar room to the one before. This room seems empty at first, but if you wait long enough, this laughing long smile appears, using the same sound as image_friend from Ralsei's excerpt at the start of this chapter. And if instead you cut down the tree on the left, you go into a very similar room, empty as well, but instead of a mouth appearing, instead these two eyes appear, which are the same eyes that are found in the first release of the Spanthan sweepstakes pages. If you cut down the trees that sort of border the paths, you're able to keep on moving, and eventually you're able to find a chest. When you open it, you get an ice key. After getting this key, the game shuts off. The second game is an altered version of Boards 2's video game, and after you get the sword once more, you're intended to kill the very same enemies and get stronger once again. Eventually, you're able to gain access to a raft that can take you to several places. One area, a heart-shaped island with red trees, that leads to this underground pathway of sorts. In this area, Tenna stands here and talks to himself. He says,
"Phew, finally some peace and quiet. I wonder if they even like the game. I'm trying my best to make it fun, but here and there, strange things are showing through. Oh, why did I base it off this stupid old thing? Kris, oh Kris, if you could just smile, laugh, tell me I'm doing something right, please."
After this dialogue, if you move, Tenna vanishes. This area that we find Tenna in reminds me a lot of Queen's Basement from Chapter 2. The colors of this area are very similar, and you have to go down a long, narrow pathway after going down a set of stairs. And another thing that sort of points to this is that this video game and Queen's Basement are where you can both find image_friend. Since Queen's Basement was most likely an area that was actually on the computer itself, and the fact that this video game uses an odd controller that could be related to the knockoff controller underneath Asriel's bed, it makes me believe that maybe this sort of game is connected to Asriel's computer in some way.
Or perhaps the person that designed this video game is the same person that helped Spamthing get the idea to go into the basement in the first place.
But through Tenna's dialogue, we learned that Kris probably isn't really having any fun in this dark world, unlike Susie and Ralsei when playing most of these games. The next room that you can find with the raft is a room that tells you to go to the Northern Light. The background of this area is blue instead of the usual black, and plays a song very reminiscent of Noel, called Northern Light. Next, if you go all the way up, you'll find an area. If you went to this area in the Tenna version of this game, the characters comment on how it looks unfinished, and Ralsei thinks that we shouldn't be here. But now with our new strength and the original game, we can go past where we couldn't before. And we were able to unlock this blue door by using the ice key that we found earlier. Inside, there are more enemies to beat, and a couple of interesting rooms along the way. One of them says, "Follow the white cloak." Another one says, "The forbidden path began with ice." And this one room has a blue bird blocking the way forward. By cutting down some orange trees after gaining enough levels, we can meet this figure with a white robe and a hood covering their face. This person, after leaving the room, now follows us, and we can use their magic to turn enemies into ice. By using this new power, we're able to freeze the blue bird that was blocking us before. We enter upon a maze-like area, and the only way to progress forward is by following the directions of this white cloaked figure. Finally, we come across a final door. This door has red horns poking out the top of it, and it has that same blue color as before. In order to open this door, we must use the ice key again, and text appears saying the ice key was used up. Then it follows by saying, "She was used up." Entering through the door, all that lies before us is a black, dark abyss, and a single voice calls out to you. This voice says,
Well done. You found my secret hiding place. But there's nothing here, is there?
If you keep walking, you find a white sparkle on the ground, and by picking it up, you get the shelter key. The voice calls out again.
Oh, you found that too. Perfect. Just perfect. Thanks for all your hard work, Kris.
And then finally, one text appears, saying, "You were used up." Alright, there's a lot to unpack here, and this has to be a direct reference to the Snowgrave route within Deltarune. This cloaked figure uses ice magic to freeze a blue bird in order to progress forward, and the placeholder sprite for this figure is a sprite of a deer. So this figure wearing the cloak has to be 100% Noelle, and the text "used up" implies our manipulation of her within the weird route. But the most disturbing aspect was that Kris is also used up. This implies that we, the player, have been manipulating Kris the same way that we manipulated Noelle within the weird route. However, I believe that this scene has sort of a double meaning going on here. Yes, it can mean us manipulating Kris, but I also think that it's representative of Kris's past. The orange trees, the enemies resembling people within a hometown, and finally the strange entity that says, "Thanks for all your hard work, Kris," before Kris is used up. To me, I see this entity as manipulating Kris to work for them, luring them into finding the shelter key. Basically, this whole sequence is a lens into the past, as well as an ominous omen for the present. However, the third game, I believe, tells us a lot more about this supposed past that Kris has. So let me explain. This third game opens up very differently than the other ones. Instead of Kris being all by themselves, we now have Susie and Ralsei following them. And instead of a map mostly based upon sand, we get this big city board map that went unused within the actual game itself. This map was originally going to be used in Tenna's third game that we were going to play within the actual game itself. However, the entire segment got scrapped because of pacing. The only remnants of this third board was the Susie Zilla minigame and this video game having the same map right here. After obtaining our sword, the only way to progress forward and gain more levels is to kill both Susie and Ralsei. Each time you stab Susie or Ralsei, Kris looks away from the screen. Just another insight to the fact that Kris doesn't want to play this game, but we, the player, do. After gaining enough levels, we're able to progress forward, and we enter upon this area with a manhole. This whole little area looks very similar to the one in the weird route, the same manhole that we used to get to Queen's Mansion. The area beyond the manhole seems to be this underground dungeon that plays a very ominous song, a song that keeps repeating the same notes over and over again, and seemingly has bit crushed sounds of waves in the background of this song. We also get introduced to some very unique enemies within this area. The boss monster-like enemies from before now shoots fire at you, another parallel to both Toriel and Asgore. We get these new monsters that seem to resemble a cat-like face, which perhaps could be representative of Caddy in Hometown since they share very similar colors. Next, we get to see this monster that has piercing blue eyes with their body obscured in darkness. It mirrors your movements exactly, and after you use it to press a button, you're able to have full control of it. The only way to progress is by bringing this monster right next to Kris, and almost on instinct, Kris reacts by stabbing and killing this monster. Now, the interesting thing with this monster is that in the files, if you turn off a variable labeled Toriel, this monster will instead be replaced by the sprite of a deer, except this one is covered in pure darkness. But since that the variable that you need to use to get this deer is called Toriel, and the parental lock in chapter 3 with Toriel's face above it has the code 1225, this deer seems to be a representation of death in some way. Lastly, we get this room filled with white monsters that look like the Dreamers. These monsters do not attack and just stand there. In order to proceed, you need to slay each and every one of them. If we assume that this yellow boss monster that has all these golden flowers surrounding it that shoots out red spears is Asgore, and that the orange ones with their fire magic were supposed to be Toriel, then would that mean that these pure white boss monsters would represent Azrael? But moving on, we again have to destroy more of these orange trees. And after walking down a long, narrow pathway, we find Tenna, the very same pathway back on the Heart Island from the second game. Tenna says,
How did things turn out like this? Keeping poor Toriel all locked up. If only he hadn't abandoned me, my old partner. I was gonna put him on TV, make him a star. I gave him everything. Everything I had. My life advice. All he had to do was tell me what his little secret was. His secret to being a big shot. It took a little sweet talk, but just when I had finally, gotten him to sign the deal, he suddenly had to take a phone call. But when he picked it up, his face turned pale, and he ran right out of the room with the receiver hanging. So I went to pick it up, thinking it was finally my chance to be a big shot. But there was nobody there. That little freak ripped me off. I wish they never brought that laptop home.
Tenna then turns around and says,
Kris, I didn't see you there. I did what you said, Kris. Just like our deal. You aren't gonna turn me off again, are you?
The only way to progress forward after getting this dialogue is to kill Tenna. Kris looking directly at the screen as this happens. The fact that Kris doesn't look away when killing Tenna implies that Kris doesn't really like Tenna. This is why they don't smile or laugh at all with Tenna's games. This is why Kris does more damage to Tenna after you get the Shadow Mantle in his boss fight. After Tenna reveals the deal that he had with Kris to the player, there's no reason to hold back anymore. Kris feels like they finally just need to cut down Tenna. And it makes me wonder, what is Kris's perspective of the Darkners in general? Do they have the same level of care for them like Susie does? Or do they see them as nothing more than objects? Excluding Ralsei, because Ralsei seems to possess very monster-like qualities and resembles a dreamer as well as Azrael. In this scene, Tenna also describes a deal that he had with Kris. And since I played the sword route on my first playthrough before getting to the final end of the chapter, I thought that this was the same deal that Tenna mentions during his backstory, before his boss fight. But we know now that Kris and the Roaring Knight are two separate people. And we also get clear, explicit knowledge in this dialogue that Tenna was working with Spamton in the past. They would be able to interact with each other every time Kris used to bring over the library's laptop to their house. Which just further proves to me that Darkner's history is based upon light world activities. If two objects occupy the same room at any point in time, then in the dark world it means that they'll have a history with each other. But this scene of Tenna picking up the hanging receiver mirrors what the Addison in chapter 2 tells us about in Spamton's backstory. Only this time, it seems to have happened before the Addison picked up the receiver in the backstory. Because this all happened before this mysterious someone left Spamton, since he was still big at the time and was in the middle of a TV deal. So what did this phone person say and tell Spamton, and why did it make him pale in the face? I believe it has to be linked to what made Spamton insane, what drove him mad in the first place. However, Tenna couldn't get this information. The person was able to hang up right before Tenna could pick up the phone, almost like they knew that Tenna would try to pull this stunt, basically telling me that Tenna, no matter how hard he tried, could never escape
his fate. He couldn't get this secret information, and he had to be left in the dark in order for chapter 3 to play out how it would. And after killing Tenna, you're able to progress forward. And something of note that happens within all these games is that after you defeat all the enemies or monsters within a certain area, this sound plays. One that depicts the sounds of waves crashing against each other. This sound will play after you kill Tenna. All the enemies in the area have been defeated. Eventually, we make our way to a direct recreation of the shelter within Hometown. Kris tries to stop us from going into the shelter, trying to move us in the opposite direction, but we move forward, and we use our shelter key to get inside. Inside, everything is dark. The only light within this area is the one that surrounds Kris. And eventually, the entity that has been haunting us all throughout the games speaks to us one more time. Their text being noticeably in lowercase, something very different from every single piece of dialogue and text that we've gotten in these games so far. This entity says,
Kris. Oh, Kris. Is it fun, Kris? Playing around like this. That's why you're searching for them, aren't you? The shadow crystals and the shadow mantle that I'm holding. Do you honestly think it'll get you what you want? No, part of you is just enjoying this, isn't it?
and you'll get this dialogue added to this line if you continue on your Weird Route save file.
The same part of you that enjoyed yesterday, knowing you could say it wasn't really you.
And then finally on both save files, it will say,
Oh, don't make that sour face. I can see it in the dark, you know. The question is, can you?
The song that plays during this dialogue is called ERAM. However, the file name for the specific song is called nightmare_nes.ogg. After the entity speaks, they reveal themselves to be a shadowy figure with two horns sticking out of its head, and we start a fight with this entity. During the fight, the entity constantly laughs at us, and even summons multiple friends to attack us. During each of its phases, the floor and walls change to depict these eyes, very similar to the eyes found within the Supply Closet Dark World in the beginning section of Chapter 3. After defeating this entity, it says,
There! That's what I wanted to see. Flickering red, like pretty little flames. Your eyes can't hide it, Kris. Without play, the knife grows dull. Well, enough of that. We both have work to do. So, if you want this mantle, hurry up and take it, if you can reach it.
The entity then disappears and a room opens up with a single chest on a ledge. Kris is too small in order to reach it, but by going out of the game, the little sprited character can walk towards Kris. In shock, Kris drops their controller on the ground, and as the character comes closer and closer, Kris keeps backing away, and eventually the little character leaves. While controlling this little character, if you go up to Kris and use the sword, Kris stumbles backwards, likely in shock from seeing the sword. Afterwards, you can make Kris go up into the game itself and open up the chest and obtain the Shadow Mantle. Susie then comes into the room after everything has sort of settled. And if you move the little character back up towards the screen and use the sword, Kris looks back and pulls Susie away from the character, hyperventilating from the events that just transpired. They did this because they feared the same thing that would happen within the game would happen within real life. Afterwards, the events of Chapter 3 continues, but if you replay Chapter 3 and lose against the knight, Gaster actually talks to you. He seems very interested that you went back and tried the fight again, and as such, he says that if you're determined enough, you should give it another shot. And with the power of the Shadow Mantle, it will help you to defeat the knight, which plays a unique cutscene. The knight, after taking so much damage, its body becomes like static, and Susie leaps forward to attack the knight. The knight in turn blocks with their sword. However, the force of the attack is still able to chip off a piece of the knight's weapon. Susie, relishing in the victory, is cut short after a huge slash goes through both her and Ralsei. And finally, the knight and Kris are left alone. The knight places their sword on Kris's shoulder and they kneel before them, almost like as if Kris is being knighted. And in the game's files, this specific animation sequence is called Kris knighting. After the knight knights Kris, Kris lies down on the ground, and the same cutscene plays out as it regularly would. Except now, you're able to get 2 items from the chipped piece of the knight's sword, a shadow crystal and a black shard. This black shard has a unique weapon icon being a black little triangle, and so far within the game, it can only be equipped by Kris and Noelle. Toriel's flavor text also changed when interacting with her. It states that her face is contorted. It looks like she's having a nightmare, in opposition to the normal dialogue stating that she's sleeping peacefully. Ralsei also has unique dialogue stating that our struggle is only beginning. Okay, so what does this mean? What is the sword route and its relation to Kris and the knight and the shadow mantle and everything that's going on? Well, let me theorize a little bit and try to come up with an answer. All right, let's go back to Tenna's deals. From this new ending cutscene where the knight knights Kris, and during the fight, Kris does the least amount of damage to the knight. And in battle, the knight doesn't ever seem to swoon Kris. And finally, if you beat the knight in a no-hit run, the flavor text reads slightly different before the end of the fight. It says, Kris coughed. The enemy slowly tilted its head. This is basically a signal from Kris to the knight saying, wrap it up, you're cooked, the player is cracked. And all this evidence just implies that Kris and the knight are working together in some sort of way. So it makes me think that Tenna's deal to keep Kris, Susie, and Ralsei busy came not only from the knight, but also Kris as well. Both the Roaring Knight and Kris together made this deal with Tenna. Kris was simply a messenger of the knight to Tenna. And also, who is Eram, or the strange entity that gives us the shadow mantle? I believe that it's actually just the Roaring Knight, or at least a representation of them. First of all, listen to Eram's boss music, and then listen to Black Knife, the Roaring Knight's battle theme. The beginning sort of portion of these songs sound very similar to each other, and we know that Toby likes to use leitmotifs and his own music to establish connections between characters. This is all throughout Deltarune as well as Undertale. And if that wasn't enough, Eram also says, "Thanks for all your hard work, Kris. And we both got work to do," which just points to the fact that this Eram entity and Kris have a working relationship with each other, very similarly to how Kris and the knight are working together. Eram is also found within the shelter, and the knight retreats back to the shelter at the end of chapter 3, both being a sort of base of operations for both of them. The fact that both the knight and Eram have distinct horns sticking out of both of their heads, and both are characters that create after images of themselves. Both characters are also very similar in personality. They seem to have this very cocky attitude that makes them taunt and laugh a lot. The boss fight room with Eram also has these eyes that are similar to the Supply Closet Dark World eyes, which the Supply Closet Dark World has a high chance of being created by the Roaring Knight. And the name Eram is backwards for the word mare, like a nightmare. And specifically after defeating the knight, Toriel is described to be having a nightmare. All this just points to Eram, this nightmare entity found within this video game, being the Roaring Knight. And the reason why it looks slightly different than the knight in appearance is because it's holding the shadow mantle, an armor piece that covers the horns and the body of the knight to look like Eram. But what does the sword game mean itself? Like I said before, I think it points to a past experience that Kris had. An experience that seemed to have traumatized Kris, and one that they are very disturbed by. And something more seemingly is going on. The lines, "Part of you is enjoying this. The same part of you that enjoyed yesterday." And then after Eram says, "Flickering red like pretty little flames. Without play, the knife grows dull." To me, this reads as Kris has done something in the past that physically hurt either one or multiple people, or even ended up killing a person. This is why these actions are related to the weird route, a route where we manipulate Noelle to kill Birdly. And the flickering red, I believe, is referencing Kris's eyes, specifically how their eyes flicker a bright red at the end of chapter 1, right after Kris pulls out their knife. And that's why I believe that the sword in this video game is a representation of Kris's knife, a knife that we, the player used to kill these monsters found within the game, referencing Undertale's genocide route. However, when the tutorial variable is turned off, being similar to tutorial's parental lock that hides the truth of December, it becomes a knife that Kris on their own uses to kill a dark deer monster that represents death with no input from the player. To me, I don't entirely believe in the idea that Kris would intentionally try to kill or hurt Des, but at least to me, I infer this moment as Kris being manipulated by someone, a person blinding them to the truth and had them hurt Des thinking that they were something else. This same person that sort of blinded Kris to the truth is the same one that had Kris used up. The same person that the door with the red devil horns represent. The same person that is associated with the devilish numbers 666. The same person that has the most wave and ocean and water-like imagery attached to them, and the same person that would know about Undertale's genocide route. However, that discussion is something that I want to cover in a future video. This is not exactly the place for it right now. And that is basically everything that I want to talk about with this sword route. I know it was kind of a long section, but one that I thought was deserved of a detailed analysis. Because if you couldn't already tell, I believe that this route hides some of the most fascinating imagery and context clues within the game itself. The last big secret within Chapter 3 is trying to get the actual egg from the man behind the tree. However, I want to save all the Eggman talk and its sequences for a later section in the video, because there is a lot to go over with that. And with all that being said, that will conclude my thoughts on Chapter 3. It was such an interesting chapter in Deltarune, and to me, it was perfect in every single way. A perfect reintroduction into the game of Deltarune after waiting so long, and was a perfect, nice little breather before things start to get more and more dark, before we get into Chapter 4. But before moving on, we have to give a word from our sponsor.
Need a big shot.
Hey guys, it's me, your Gru.
Hey, that video is pretty good. Let me see if this guy has any way I can actually, support him. Wait, what? Are you kidding? This guy doesn't even have anything to support him on. What am I gonna do now?
Have you ever been in a situation like this? Because we have the solution for you. Now introducing the FakeyMcFake Patreon. Every single dollar goes into making Fakey have more time to go into videos. But wait, there's more. We have exclusive rewards for our paying members. Every single member will get early access to videos at least one day ahead of schedule. Your name featured at the end of videos. And for any video that requires a viewer response, we'll be looking at the Patreon members' submissions first. You get these rewards if you're just a $1 patron, but if you upgrade to a $3 tier or higher, you'll get exclusive bonus content like short gameplays with commentary and talking podcast-like videos. And you'll also get exclusive behind-the-scenes content like art, clips, and audio. Oh, but little Marcus, what's wrong? Why so sad?
I want to support FakeyMcFake, but I'm not in the financial situation in order to do so by the Patreon.
Don't worry, little Marcus. The Patreon is not a necessity. And if you want to support the channel for free, remember to always subscribe, like, share, and comment on videos. Those really help boost the video's attention and definitely does mean a lot to Fakey. If you want more information about the Patreon or would like to join, the link will be in the description. But with that all said, it's time to get back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Now's your chance to be a big shot. Ride around in our new Concadero, only at Big Shot.
Chapter 4 of Deltarune was the chapter I think most people expected to be the big chapter in terms of lore. And after actually playing through the chapter myself, I think it definitely delivered on that fact. Because the new lore that Chapter 4 introduces has sparked so many speculations and theories in this Chapter 3 and 4 era. So, without further delay, let's just dive right into it. We start off the chapter with Kris and Susie sealing the Chapter 3 Dark Fountain, only for it to be part of a dream that Kris had in their sleep sleep, being woken up by Toriel. Just added to the pile of evidence that dark worlds are heavily tied to dreams. Toriel seems to play off the dark world of chapter 3 as just some sort of weird dream that she had, and later on decides to take Susie and Kris to the church for a weekend service. This whole start of chapter 4 is interesting to me because it's kind of weird that we didn't get to see the resolution with the shelter opening up at the end of chapter 3. The shelter specifically opened up when Kris was alone, and we the player never get to see what happens after that, which just sort of adds to further evidence of Kris and the Knight sort of working together. The Knight opening the shelter for Kris, possibly to give Kris instructions on what to do next. But before we go into the church, there's a couple of interesting tidbits and information that I want to know. First of all, in chapter 4, save points are now found within the light world. It's not a specific character or a different item that acts as a save. It is just a faded out version of the dark world save point. No change. This to me just sort of points to the fact that save points within Deltarune aren't going to be as important as they were in Undertale. However, we know that the save files themselves are kind of important because we get that weird Gaster sequence in chapter 1. Another piece of info that we get is that the stain next to the birdcage in Kris's room is actually a blood stain. Susie immediately knows what this is after we interact with it and helps Kris to clean it up. But it says a lot that Toriel hasn't done anything about this stain when she's been to Kris's room multiple times within the game itself and seems to pay it no mind. Another thing about Kris's room is that Azrael's computer, it has a wallpaper of a poorly drawn image by both Kris and Azrael. Susie notes that one of the characters on the wallpaper looks like Sham from Castletown. Does this mean that Sham was actually Azrael's stuffed animal all along? And that maybe Azrael was also a part of this make-believe game that Kris would play with this girl as well? The last piece of information in the Dreamer household that I want to note is that on the fridge, there's a photo of Azrael. Susie says at first that it's a Photoshop version of Ralsei, but Kris is quick to point out all the differences between Ralsei and Azrael. And I can't believe Photoshop was actually just name dropped in Deltarune. But this idea just sort of makes me lean more towards the fact that Ralsei's appearance is a manifestation of what Kris would want to look like if they were a monster. You know, if they looked exactly like the boss monsters that Toriel, Asgore, and Azrael are. Which, I guess now that I'm thinking about it, sort of makes sense. Azrael is a combination of Toriel and Asgore's names. So wouldn't a sibling to Azrael have the name be an anagram of Azrael itself? And the fact that Ralsei has these colored horns makes me think more that Ralsei is the red horn headband that Kris used to wear, trying to be more monster-like. But that's everything for the Dreamer household, and after we get all this information, we go into the church and learn more about the religion of Hometown. The ruined robes that Toriel wears in Undertale are the exact same robes as the ones that the choir wears within the church. The tale and legend of the Deltarune is not only something within the Dark World, but also is something within the Light World, and is the basis of the Hometown's religion. However, this version of the legend is slightly different from the one that we're familiar with. It is still a story foretold by time and space. However, the angel watches over the Lightners. Heroes are still present, but no images of them are actually known. They could be any of the Lightners found within the Light World. Heroes that are foretold to stop a great calamity from occurring and to ultimately save the world. The most interesting aspect to me about the Light World's religion is that it is still a story foretold by time and space. Time and space obviously having a connection to Gaster, a person that was shattered across time and space. This just shows to me that Gaster has control over both the Light World and the Dark World, having influence within both of their legends. But after going through service, Susie and Kris want to find out the codes to the shelter in order to save Undyne from the night. And by asking around the people within the church, we're able to get some pretty interesting information. It seems like the shelter has been closed for a decent amount of time, and Alphys herself says it's been closed for as long as she's been in Hometown. Alphys also believes that whatever lies inside the shelter could be more dangerous than whatever can be found outside. She also says that she's only seen 2 people go inside the bunker itself, that being Undyne and the mayor, which means that the both of them have codes into the shelter. We also learn from Noelle that the mayor keeps everything that she deems as important inside of her own house. This includes any documents, any keys, and even any homemade decorations. But that is all the important information that we get in this little church section of chapter 4. But since we're on the topic of the shelter and its codes, to me, I believe that the actual symbols on the shelter relate to specific characters within the game itself. The badge could be a representation of any of the police officers within Hometown, the pine tree could be a member of the Holiday family, and the Deltarune could relate to any person that frequents the church. And to me, when I think about this, there's one character that actually seems to relate to all three symbols, that being Asgore. He used to be the chief of police, he's a close friend of the Holiday family, and attends the church frequently at night, which could imply that in the past, Asgore also had an experience with the shelter. However, after we leave the church, we're able to go to two important places to progress the story, that being Castletown and the Holiday household after Noelle invites us to her house. So why don't we take a stop into Castletown first? So the reason why we want to go to Castletown is because Susie wants to hear what Ralsei has to think about this whole shelter situation. And in response, Ralsei instead assures that Undyne is not in any immediate danger and that Susie and Kris should just not worry about it and should just relax while they're within Castletown. A very interesting response from Ralsei after learning that Undyne has been taken to the dangerous shelter that has the knight that one-shotted the entire Fun Gang. But overall, Castletown has gotten a major upgrade. The town has a lot more space and the buildings are actually animated compared to before. It seems to be a direct correlation to the Darkners that you recruit. If you don't recruit any Darkners, some rooms will be completely dull or empty compared to their more livelier versions when you do recruit them. But now that we defeated the knight and got a shadow crystal, why don't we talk to Sham? It seems that Sham expected us to fight the knight and also expected us to lose horribly, but is generally surprised that we actually won and are finally able to feel hopeful in general. Sham also says that now that we have 3 shadow crystals total, we only need 2 more in order to make something that Sham thinks that we'll quite enjoy. And then Sham gives us a hint onto the next secret boss. They say that the next opponent should be enough to ring the bell on our defeat, which is some very interesting dialogue for if you already know who the chapter 4 secret boss actually is. But these shadow crystals seem to play a very important role to the game of Deltarune, even with the fact that they weren't included in the survey program of chapter 1 all those years ago. But the dialogue from Eram in the sword route just sort of reinforces the fact that the shadow crystals are going towards something that Kris sort of wants, or something that the player wants. We already know that shadow crystals are a very powerful item, so if we collect 5 of these shadow crystals that Sham says that we need, this item that we'll get from them could be a very powerful item, probably one of the most powerful within the entire game. Maybe it's powerful enough to sort of change fate in a way. I also want to bring up the point that it seems like the defeat of the knight could lead to an entirely different outcome than if you didn't defeat them. We can infer this a little bit because in the second wave of Spanton sweepstakes pages, there's a page that has different numbers, each of the numbers sort of correlating to a chapter in Deltarune, all of them having a different size. The one that has the biggest size is easily chapter 2, which we know has the weird route. If you click on that chapter 2 number, we even get the music that plays when Noelle and Birdley encounter each other within the weird route, which implies that the number's sizes correlate to the impact that the weird route has within the game. And as we know, the weird route seems to be going against the fated prophecy of Deltarune. Obviously, chapter 2 would be the biggest number because this is where we actually begin the weird route and where it has the most effect, being that we snowgrave Birdley. However, next to it is a hidden chapter 3 number. And if you go to a separate page labeled chapter 2, it says applicable. For chapter 3, it says not applicable but, which means that it's not applicable to the weird route, but still has a huge impact on the story itself. And I think that entirely has to do with the idea of us getting a black shard and a shadow crystal after we defeat the knight, most likely after we get the shadow mantle from the sword route. Because when you click on the hidden chapter 3 number, we get the sound effect that Eram makes before we are able to get the shadow mantle. Sham never expected us to beat the knight, and we were never expected to get this shadow crystal. However, if you don't get the shadow crystal in chapter 3, you're still able to make this item that Sham wants to make with all 5 shadow crystals. So if you exclude chapter 7, which is going to be the end of the game, so there's not going to be any point in getting a shadow crystal, and exclude chapter 3, since it seems like we weren't supposed to get that, we have 5 chapters left. Enough chapters to get 5 shadow crystals to make this forged item with Sham. So perhaps if we get an extra shadow crystal and the unique black shard weapon, something entirely different could happen. Perhaps in chapter 3 with that gumball machine, with the triangle lacquer object that makes you see through your hand, could maybe be hinting at some sort of outcome that we get if we get this extra shadow crystal and the black shard with a triangle-like icon for its weapon. But anyway, moving on. Within Castletown, there are some new rooms and areas that have opened up. We get a building for the Rock Band minigame from chapter 3, as well as a room for Mike within said building, and we get new rooms within the actual castle itself. Alright, so let's talk about Mike and the Mike room. So first and foremost, I want to preface that this section of the game was clearly something added towards the end of chapter 4's development. It seems that this area of the game was an area entirely made for us, the fans of the game, fans like me and you that love Deltarune so much that we theorize and brain rot ourselves. So Toby added a sequence involving Mike that sort of makes everyone's like theories about Mike correct all at once. You know, Mike is a microphone. Mike is a cat. There are more than one Mike. Mike is friend. Mike doesn't speak. Mike has a relation to Woody with the cowboy hat. This is mostly just like a fun bonus that you can get at the end of chapter 4 after learning the code for Mike, and you can even play those mini games designed mostly for the Switch 2. And if you go back into the room, we even get to know what Plooey is. And what sort of just sets this home for me is that at the end of this sequence, we get a direct reference to us theorists. When the green Pippin brings out a corkboard with red lines drawn across it, trying to theorize who Mike even is. However, I've seen people online sort of think that this whole sequence implies that Mike is something more to the game of Deltarune, but this sort of train of thought about Mike is what Toby is sort of poking fun at with the whole corkboard scene. Mike was always supposed to be a character that was a teaser for chapter 3, and never something really more than that. And that's why I believe that the fact that we got Mike's room is just a bonus for us, for the fans, and to give us some sort of conclusion to his character. But that is everything that I have to say about Mike, because obviously it's not too lore relevant, so let's move on. So if you recruit all the Darkners in Castletown and go down to the cell with King, you're able to talk to him about various topics. If you talk about the Knight, King asks what they look like, implying that King never knew the Knight's appearance, and in turn, never met them face to face. And if you talk to King about Jevil, he says that Jevil was the one who told him about the Knight in the first place, and how that King would rise to power. So it seems that King didn't really know his role within the prophecy or the fated legend itself before Jevil told him, and that Jevil was the one that entirely knew what would transpire with King. This very interesting detail sort of makes me think, how much do the Darkners actually know about the prophecy? It's honestly really hard to say with the information we got right now. And if you go up to the 3rd floor of the castle, you're able to see Tenna and Queen's rooms. And it looks like in this hallway, there seems to be enough space for 2 more rooms to appear. So what this means is that most likely we're expected 2 more major Dark World antagonists that we can bring to our Castletown. And the last important thing in this hallway is that we finally get to see what's inside of Ralsei's room. Inside this room, it's completely empty. Ralsei, believing that he's not worthy of an actual room, leaves it completely blank because he's just a Darkner. This ties ultimately into Ralsei's sort of developed character that we get in chapters 3 and 4, and I want to save a more character-focused section for later on after we go through chapter 4. And with all that, that concludes our visit to Castletown. And I'll just say this, it seems that being able to recruit every Darkner in each Dark World is somewhat important to the story. It leads to us getting more answers within the game itself, and a more enjoyable experience overall. I have no idea if this will sort of affect a different outcome for our heroes, but I can definitely tell you that it'll make the journey to the end at least a more enjoyable one. Alright, so now it's finally time to visit Noelle's house. And this whole sequence has so much stuff to unpack, so let's just dive right into it. First of all, Noelle and Susie make an Among Us reference in the year of 2025. I can tell that this joke was supposed to come out when it was more relevant. And that's already some huge lore, but Noelle's mom seems to own a katana in the kitchen, which Noelle says is used to cut fruitcake. Noelle's pencil found on her desk was taken by Kris out of habit, and this pencil later can become the Jingle sword within the Dark World, a sword that both Noelle and Kris can equip. In Noelle's closet, there's a set of angel wings from when she was a part of the holiday pageant, another connection of the angel being tied directly to Noelle. Noelle's mom also seems to be a collector of heart-shaped pillows that when you interact with it, Noelle comments that when Kris and her were younger, Kris would take out one of these pillows and pretend to rip out their own heart and chase around Noelle. This is clearly a reference to how Kris removes the soul from their own body, but it seems like this implies that this is something that Kris knew how to do ever since they were a little kid. And if you interact with it again, Noelle says that her mom just loves red heart-shaped objects, which is very interesting with something that comes up later on. After we start the study session, Susie and Noelle look for Noelle's phone, and Kris uses the opportunity to explore the house alone. If you interact with the red heart-shaped pillow again, it says it's a heart or a human soul-shaped pillow, depending on your opinion. So maybe Noelle's mom has a fascination with human souls. In Noelle's room, her computer wallpaper cycles between various different images. One of Noelle's family in the snow, another of Noelle's family looking festive, Noelle's family edited to be elves, a motion blurred photo of Kris as a kid, Des holding a cracked baseball bat, a picture of a far off snowy city, and Noelle and Des at the pageant as kids, and lastly a green puppet looking thing. This picture of a far off snowy city is most likely the city that Des describes to Noelle that we hear about in chapter 2. And lastly, we are able to go into Des's room. The computer's monitor is unplugged. Underneath her bed lies army rations, guitar picks, paintball gear, ice skates, and a badly traced drawing of a dragon. This drawing of a dragon clearly just shows to us that Azrael and Des would most likely draw dragons together using the How to Draw a Dragon book. Underneath Des's CD player are punk rock CDs and one still sealed ska CD. This is likely a gift from Azrael since we know that he likes religious ska music. But for Des, it doesn't really seem to be her taste in music, hence why it is still sealed. In an old box in Des's room, we find a couple of burnt lighters, rusted multi-tool knives, expired rations, walkie-talkies, loose binoculars, a pair of shoes that fit hooves, violent comic books, paintballs, a cracked hockey mask, frayed yarn and buttons, Azrael's retainer, and old mint cans that have strange leaves inside of them. We also find rollerblades and a wiffle bat right next to the box, which makes Kris's head hurt just by looking at these items. On her closet door are handmade band posters for shows that may or may not have ever happened. And finally, a red guitar with a code on the inside. It states shelter and reads the numbers 1, 2, 2. But then we are swiftly cut off by Kris ripping out their own soul. Kris then takes the soul and throws it into a gift box downstairs. Okay, so let's analyze a little bit. This guitar is the same one on the Find Her page in the first wave of the Spamton sweepstakes. The fact that it contains a code for the shelter just proves to me that Des is located somewhere within this shelter. And all this gear like army rations, survival-like gear, multi-tool knives, binoculars, and lighters just shows to me that Des was most likely an explorer, likely spending a large amount of time within the forest of Hometown, which could explain why she seemingly got lost within the shelter itself. It was just another part of exploring the woods, which ties directly into lyrics of Raise Up Your Bat. When the demon heart is crying, raise up your bat for the burning fight. Come follow me into the dark with your heart as the ark, which shall guide you the way through the waves. This is referring to the time that Des and Kris went into the bunker or shelter. The demon can relate its way to Gaster and its devilish nature, and guiding them through the waves correlates to the water motif in the dark worlds that are more specifically associated with Gaster. Not to mention all the wave sounds that we hear within the sword route of the video game, which most likely means that Raise Up Your Bat is a song that takes takes place within the shelter. It paints a picture of Des having to fight various enemies within the shelter, bat in hand, having to have Kris light the way with their soul. That's why the wiffle bat itself looks so bent. It was heavily damaged in this encounter with the shelter, and that's why looking at these items, more specifically the bat, makes Kris's head hurt. On that day, Des's strength wasn't enough to save her with this shelter experience. Only Kris was able to escape, bringing back the damaged wiffle bat and skates. At least that's my interpretation of what the Raise Up Your Bat song means and its correlation to the items in Des's room. Continuing on, Kris leaves the room and the soul is able to escape through a vent in the back of the wall, where we can be like a fly on the wall listening in onto everyone's conversations and interactions within the actual holiday house. During this entire section where you control the soul, a new song plays that has the leitmotif of Find Her. This song is called The Distance Between Two. Already, Toby is saying that our goals as a player should be to find Des, and that the name Distance Between Two could either reference the distance between Des and Noelle, or the distance between Kris and the soul, since this plays when we were separated. But if you go to the kitchen, you can see Kris with their phone on the counter, and a strange person seems to speak through this phone with a sort of distorted speech box. It says, "Dark Fountain next. Susie must not get guitar. Needs soul. Without soul, Kris will. Susie guitar. Code stop. Police sacrifice next week. Church tonight. Kris, Dark World. No soul. Can't." If you fly out of this vent, Kris will either pounce onto the soul or throw a bottle at it, and they will look directly into the camera, the perspective of the player as they hold the soul. So already some insane information, but this isn't the last time that we'll hear from this mysterious phone person. So I want to break it down more when we get to cover all the dialogue. If you go back to the same area again, Kris instead plays the piano and plays some songs that are within the game of Deltarune, like, It's Pronounced Rules and Acid Tunnel of Love, just to name a few. However, there are a couple of songs that stand out, a couple of which don't have a direct parallel within the game of Deltarune itself. The song that you're hearing right now is called Kris_piano_waiting room. This song seems to combine some of the TV world leitmotifs, but also adds its own unique melody to it. And the song just seems to have a lot of emotion tied to it. You can tell with how it's played on the piano. And to me personally, I think that this might be Kris's theme. It has the leitmotifs of a dark world that Kris made themselves, and the emotion tied to it just further emphasizes that fact. And perhaps this could appear in a future chapter where Kris and the soul are fully separated, and we're able to interact with Kris as if they were any other character within the game itself. And the other song that I want to point out is called Kris_piano_last prophecy that you're hearing right now. It seems to combine the Castletown motif with a new motif, a new melody. And since the name is Last Prophecy, it means that this is likely a song that will appear at the end of the game in chapter 7. It's a very melancholy and sort of sad song, which, since it has the theme of Castletown within it, makes me think that this is the song that will play when you finally have to say goodbye to all the people within Castletown and the dark worlds and the dark nerds in general. And lastly, the other unique song that we get is called Kris_piano_74. I've heard some people think that this might be Kris's theme, but I don't know. To me, this just seems like a song that would be played as Kris, Susie, and Noelle are all having fun at the festival, living their life to the fullest. But the numbers of 7-4 seem sort of weirdly important to this song, and I'm not gonna entirely act like I know what this could mean, but I'm curious to see what you guys have to think about this. Something else that we get in these sort of sequences with Kris is that now we know that Kris is able to walk perfectly fine without the soul. Even surprisingly pretty fast in a couple of scenes. Alright, so I'ma keep it real with you guys. I have no idea why Kris was walking so slowly without their soul for the whole 2 first chapters. Maybe it was just Kris pranking us, the player, all along, making us believe that Kris needed the soul when in actuality they don't. I have no idea. Moving on. If you go to the bathroom, you're able to see Asgore within there. It seems that he's been cleaning the bathroom, but has some interesting lines to say, like, "Now more than ever, I need to concentrate, and to settle this once and for all." After Asgore says this, he leaves the room, but you can follow him up into Carol and Rudy's room. Inside of this room, there seems to be a black katana and a corkboard with various papers and red lines connecting them. Asgore, while in this room, says, "We're almost there, aren't we, old friend? This time for sure, Tori will finally see what really happened. That I wanted to protect everyone, and this time she'll have to believe me. They all will. Then we'll all be a happy family again, won't we? It sure is beautiful, isn't it? This black shard." Okay, so crazy thing, Asgore has a black shard, and I know that some people believe that this might be a shadow crystal, but as we know, shadow crystals in the light world are described to be very glass-like, and are just straight up called glass within the menu. And the way that Asgore describes it being a black shard is the exact same name of the item that we get from the knight that Kris can equip on their weapon slot. So this could mean that Asgore actually has a connection to the knight in some way. Or maybe he even had an encounter with the knight and was able to get a black shard off of them. And going off of this point, if you check Asgore's flower shop in chapter 4 of Hometown, it seems that Asgore also has a corkboard in his flower shop basement. And I assume that this has a connection to the corkboard within Carol and Rudy's room. After leaving this area, eventually you make your way into the basement of the holiday house. You turn off the lights by messing with the breaker, which makes Susie and Noelle come downstairs to investigate, but thankfully, and luckily for you, an angel doll falls right over the soul, which makes them believe that it could be something else. But the fact that an angel doll specifically falls on top of us, the player, it just points heavily towards player angel theory. However, in this little segment, you're able to get some pretty interesting dialogue. Noelle says that in her Dragon Blazers game, there are underground levels that have music that repeats over and over again, and is part of the reason why Noelle is afraid of basements. Since we know that Dragon Blazers is a parallel to Deltarune, to me this clearly spells out the sword route in the video game in chapter 3. It's a dark dungeon with a repeating music track over and over again. Furthermore, Noelle states that in Dragon Blazers there was an evil route within the game. Noelle, not wanting her parents to find out about it, played it in secret. Obviously, this is kind of referencing the weird route in the game of Deltarune. However, Susie describes this evil route as needing to kill every enemy within the Dragon Blazers game, which is different from the weird route, but very similar to Undertale's genocide route, which could mean that this evil route, instead of being a reference to the weird route, could instead relate to the sword route, where we find that dungeon and we have to kill every single enemy in order to progress. These enemies that look a lot like Undertale characters specifically. However, after we progress and we move towards either Noelle or Susie, they both get startled and take us upstairs. And initially my first reaction to seeing this was like, oh my god, Susie and Noelle are gonna find out about the soul! They're gonna take off the angel doll and get to see the truth! But Toby teases me once again, and they leave the room and we're able to take the opportunity to escape back into Des's room. Kris knew exactly what we were trying to do and stopped us right in our tracks. Susie and Noelle still want to find this creature that seemingly escaped and go up into Des's room. Kris, in a panic, hides inside Des's closet, and we get some good old-fashioned Tom and Jerry type shenanigans with the soul and Kris. But during this epic battle between Kris and the soul, Noelle and Susie actually start talking about some pretty interesting things. In this conversation, Noelle talks about her dream, the dream that she had in chapter 2. Noelle seems to acknowledge Ralsei's existence and says that he looks a little like Azrael. Noelle also describes Kris as not acting like their normal self, and that they instead acted like how they do recently. That Kris had this look that they wanted to say something, but everything that came out of their mouth sounded odd. Alright, so this whole conversation, Noelle is acknowledging more about her dream, which could mean that she could eventually learn that the Dark Worlds are actually real and that they're not actually a dream very, very soon. But anyway, after we play the guitar, Susie grabs it from Kris and brings it downstairs to play for Noelle. Kris then tells this mysterious person on the phone about this, and they say that they'll be right over. And after telling this person this, Kris puts back the soul and has deleted all recent dials and contacts on their phone. Meanwhile, while Noelle and Susie are having a heart-to-heart, Carol comes home from work early and takes the guitar away from Susie. She tells Susie to leave and tells Noelle to go into the kitchen. And after Susie and Asgore have left the house, and as Kris tries to leave, we get a cold hand placed on our shoulder coming from Carol. Carol then tells us this line, "As you know, you are welcome here anytime." The text "you" being colored in bold red text. After saying this, Carol goes back to scolding Noelle as we leave the house. Okay, so let's talk Carol. It seems that she is the mysterious person on the phone. After the call says, "I'll be right there," Carol is the one that shows up early from work to the holiday house and takes the guitar from Susie. She seemingly knows about the existence of the player since the U is colored in bright red, reminiscent of the soul, and could explain her fascination with heart-shaped objects, or as Kris likes to say, human soul-shaped objects. But now that we know that Carol's the one on the phone, it means that she knows about the next Dark World location, being that of the church. Spoilers, by the way, for the next section. Which means that she has to have a connection in some way to the Night, the being that is creating these dark fountains in the first place. Kris is not only working for the Night, but is also working with Carol, since Kris is the one that informs her about Susie getting the guitar in the first place. Which means that one of Kris and Carol's goal is to not have Susie and the player go into the shelter. At least, not yet in this current point in the story. But since we know that Carol has access to the shelter, it's not too far-fetched of an idea to think that her working is actually her doing whatever business that she has within the shelter. This work within the shelter could possibly relate to the police sacrifice next week that she talks about to Kris, which means that she clearly knows about Undyne's condition and what to do with her next. All some very, very intriguing stuff, and it just shows that Carol will be playing a huge role within the game of Deltarune itself. But that concludes all the lore relevant information with the holiday house, and now it's time to delve into the darkness with the dark world of chapter 4. So Kris and Susie go into the church looking for Toriel, but they see that there's actually a dark world inside. Them being worried about Toriel, jump inside and try to stop the Knight. The Knight, however, taunts them at the top of this staircase, one that leads directly to the Dark Fountain. Usually what's supposed to happen is that the Knight will send down like a bajillion swords and you're supposed to take enough damage that you're not able to make it to the top. However, if you're gamer enough, you're actually able to dodge all of the swords and get directly to the top face to face with the Knight. Kris doesn't really act while at the top of this staircase. They just stand there and wait for the Knight to unleash a devastating attack that launches them down anyway. Susie even makes a comment about this, which just further points to the fact that Kris and the Knight are working together, so add it onto the pile of evidence. And throughout this church dark world, you're able to see these glass panels. These panels depict the prophecy in a lot more detail than what Ralsei had told us in the beginning of chapter 1. And I'm sorry for doing this all again, but I want to push all the panels to the wayside for a little bit and focus more on the events of chapter 4 before we get into the detailed discussion of each and every panel. And another interesting point about this dark world is that a good chunk of the darkners are actually already stone when you enter. This is kind of completely new for any sort of dark world that we've been in so far. But to me, the fact that this is happening and the fact that the chapter 3 darkners inside of their own TV world are turning to stone at the end implies that perhaps the roaring might be closer than what we think. The roaring is described as when complete darkness has filled the sky, the darkness will turn to stone, and perhaps we're seeing remnants of that early on right now. It seems that we might have had the causing of the roaring a little bit wrong, because it doesn't seem like you need a bunch of dark fountains open up at the same time in order for the roaring to occur. Each and every dark fountain that has been made in general just inches closer and closer to the roaring. Anyway, moving on, we get this section in the dark world and we're covered in complete darkness, and a single entity with a red glow slowly inches its way towards Kris, Susie, and Ralsei. Keep this creature in mind because I'll bring it up again later, but luckily for the fun gang, we are actually saved by Gerson Boom! Yes, Gerson, the dead father of Alvin, is inside of this dark world. He's able to move around, talk and interact just like any normal person would. So we take Gerson back to his study, we get a little legend about a mystical hammer, and we need to explore these various areas within the Church Dark World in order to progress forward. We get an absolutely hilarious fight with this darkner named Jackenstein, where we get introduced to a new mechanic where you're covered in complete darkness and your TP gain is reduced. The only really important thing lore-wise that happens within this fight is that during one of Jackenstein's attacks, there's a grid-like pattern on the floor, each grid having a different symbol attached to them. There seems to be a king and queen's crown, a bishop chess piece, a flower, a knight chess piece, and a sword. This seems to be relating to each and every chapter's Dark World. You know, the king's crown for chapter 1, the queen's crown for chapter 2, the bishop piece for chapter 4 since we're in a church, the knight chess piece for chapter 3 since we fight the knight at the end, and perhaps a flower for the flower shop Dark World, and a sword, which could be something for chapter 6, but I don't entirely know what it could relate to. My only real guess I would have to say is maybe it could be relating to the holiday house, because you know, Carol does have a big ass sword inside of her own house, and it's kind of implied that we might be fighting her in an up and coming chapter because she seems to be taking a very strong antagonist role within the game. So maybe a Dark World in the holiday house could be a chapter 6 thing, I don't know. Anyway, after finishing the Jackenstein fight and after exploring a little more, we get an interesting scene. The fun gang is all together, but Susie just eagerly goes out in front of them and goes into a room up above, and Ralsei seems to take this opportunity to try to have Kris imagine what Susie is doing, which is just such a weird thing for Ralsei to do. I mean, Susie's in the next room. Why do we need to close our eyes and think about her right now? However, there's some interesting things you can get if you do close your eyes. No matter which option you choose, Ralsei will run off to the side of the screen, leaving Kris by themselves with their eyes closed. There's an interesting scene that we do get with this in the weird route, but I want to cover that in its entire weird route section on its own. So let's go into the other options. When you think about the knight, you try to imagine what their face could look like, but it seems like Kris is trying to stop you from knowing their identity and constantly tries to distort the imagery with pictures of like Jockington and Temmie both having soccer balls in a bird's nest, which gave me very similar vibes to this one scene of Adventure Time where this mind reader Goliad tries to invade Finn's mind to try to learn about PB's plan to stop them, but Finn, every time he tries to think about it, distorts his own imagination so that it doesn't get revealed. But just added again to the pile of evidence that Kris and the knight are working together. Kris does not want us to know the true identity of the knight. Moving on, you're able to progress forward, and eventually you need to play this grand piano. And the most interesting part to me is that after Susie encourages Kris to play the piano on their own, they seem to take back control of their own body and play the piano by themselves. And I know we had a few instances where Kris would sometimes sort of muffle the player's dialogue or react differently than the player, but this is a full-on moment where Kris, with the soul inside of them, is able to take back control for themselves. However, it doesn't seem to last forever, as Kris kind of stops playing the piano, and Susie asks why did they stop so abruptly. This sequence and all the stuff that we get in chapter 4, 3, 2, and 1 about Kris and the soul, it just makes me ask, is Kris choosing to relinquish their control to the player? When the soul is removed, they can seemingly act just fine without it, and for a long period of time too. But instead, each and every time, they choose to put the soul back into them. And I believe that the reason why they do this is because of this plan that Kris and Carol have with each other. Carol on the phone constantly mentions about Kris and the soul, almost like it's a key part to their plan. And even though Kris sort of takes every opportunity to remove the soul and get a break, it seems like at the end of the day, they still must follow this plan and put the soul back in. All just some very interesting things to consider. Before you go to the end of this dark world, you can gather 3 sheets of golden music and are able to climb to the top and reach this golden piano. Upon playing it, the fireplace in Gerson's study will open up and you're able to get a very interesting sequence. In order to receive this mystical hammer and a shadow crystal, you have to fight Gerson Boom, the Hammer of Justice. That's right, Gerson Boom was the secret boss of Chapter 4 and dons the title of Hammer of Justice, the same title that he had in Undertale all those years ago. And the dialogue that we get in the Gerson fight is super interesting and hints heavily towards the future of the game, but I want to establish one piece of information first before we dive deep into that. At the end of the fight, it is confirmed that the Lord of the Hammer books are based upon the prophecy, and that the game Dragon Blazers is based off of Lord of the Hammer, which means that all these stories are parallel to the game of Deltarune itself. And at the end, Susie asks what character of Dragon Blazers that she is, and Gerson says that she's the dragon. Alright, so now that we have that information established, what does Gerson actually say in his fight? At the start of the fight, Susie says, "You're facing a hero. There isn't anything that's gonna stand in our way." And Gerson's response to this is,
"Ain't every story better with a little twist?"
This line of dialogue sort of hints towards an idea that I'll bring up when discussing all the panels within Chapter 4, but to me this line sort of reads as Gerson sort of directly relating to Susie and her hero status. But the fight continues, and Gerson recounts the chapters of each of the Lord of the Hammer books. He says,
Chapter 1, The March of the Dark King. The heroes defeat the king and stop the dragon.
This is referencing Chapter 1 of Deltarune, defeating the Spade King and stopping Susie from wrecking the citizens of the Dark World. In Chapter 2, Gerson says,
Chapter 2, The City of the Shining. The heroes do battle in chariots to save the queen.
The chariots are the roller coasters that we fight in Chapter 2, and the act of saving the queen could be actually saving Queen herself from her plan at the end of Chapter 2, when she learns about what the roaring actually is. For Chapter 3, Gerson says,
Chapter 3, The Isles of Northern Light. The heroes travel among the islands and catch a glimpse of the lost land.
As I talked about in the Sword Route section of the video, Northern Light is a song within that game, and specifically in the blue room that hints toward the door that you need to use the ice key on. However, I can also see the Northern Light referencing the end area of Chapter 3, the area right before the Dark Fountain where everything is covered in snow. The reason I believe this is because the Sword Route seems like a route that we're not supposed to take, something that goes a little bit against the fate of the prophecy, which the Lord of the Hammer books are based upon. And the word Northern Lights actually refers to the Aurora Borealis within our real world, a set of natural lights found in usually cold places, and look very similar to how a dark fountain appears within the Dark World. And the different islands that Gerson mentions are referring to Tenna's various video games. One of them is even set on an island, and the Lost Land could honestly be referring to the TV world itself, since Tenna and much of the Darkners haven't been used in a long time, and some are even lost beneath the couch. For Chapter 4, Gerson says,
Chapter 4, The Trials of the Holy Hammer. A great smith gives the heroes a terrible weapon.
This describes the actual fight itself with Gerson, and the fact that one of the prophecy panels is in the background of this whole fight depicting a hammer means that this is prophesized within the actual prophecy itself. Even though it is technically a secret, it's something that is fated to happen. So what does Gerson mean when he's talking about this weapon? Well, obviously we get a hammer at the end of this fight by Gerson, and some people think that this bad, terrible weapon literally means that the weapon is just trash in combat, since it doesn't have any unique effects tied to it. But the personal way that I see this is that this word terrible could mean that it's extremely powerful, a power that could be used to cause some sort of event that could lead to something bad. When we get the hammer, the effect itself has question mark written on it. So it has to do something. The only real question is what will trigger this effect? And this is a little personal theory that I have, but I believe that if Susie has this weapon equipped and she fights the party, this effect will be triggered. It has already been heavily theorized that Susie will eventually fight the party within the game. Her theme versus Susie is played when the player isn't even fighting her, which means that this probably isn't the only time that this theme is played and will be played against a fight against Susie, you know, versus Susie. So maybe if we do eventually fight Susie, it awakens some sort of power within the hammer and makes the fight extremely challenging when normally it shouldn't be, which could lead to a very different outcome in the fight than what would have happened normally. But we'll see how it actually plays out within the game and what this effect could actually mean. Next, Gerson says,
Chapter 5, The Field of Pink and Gold. The vast garden is charred in an inferno of jealousy.
Obviously, we haven't reached Chapter 5 yet, but this sort of gives us a glimpse into what the chapter could entail. It's pretty likely that this garden is referencing the Flower King shop that Asgore runs, and since Asgore uses fire magic in Undertale and is currently going through a divorce with Toriel, that inferno of jealousy could easily mean that he will be inside of this dark world, which is most likely what that symbol in the Jackenstein fight is referencing. Asgore will most likely take up the title of Flower King and become the ruler of this dark world, and will be a boss that we have to fight at the end of the chapter. But the line "field of pink and gold" is very interesting. When I first think of gold and flowers, I immediately think of, the golden flower that Asgore has in his shop, a flower that looks almost identical to Flowey from Undertale. However, the combinations of pink and gold could more obviously relate to friend. Those colors have been appearing more and more within the game of Deltarune and seem to always mean something deeper than just a simple two colors. So maybe this chapter is where we can actually finally meet friend for the first time. For the next chapter, Gerson says that it was never written. The story became so overwhelming that the author himself was swallowed up. The youth and the next generation were supposed to pick up this pen and continue the story where it left off, but unfortunately they never did. And Gerson notes that Susie has a flame lit up inside her, a flame of a story waiting to be told. Gerson asks what ending that Susie would have for the story. In response, Susie says that she doesn't want an ending. She wants the story to continue forever. Gerson says to hold on to that idea because the tides of fate are drawing close, and soon an ocean of ink shall wash across the page. That the only thing that can overwrite the dark is a weight pen of hope, one that Gerson believes Susie possesses. Personally, I feel like Gerson with these lines are telling us about the ending of Deltarune to some extent, or at least how chapter 7 will conclude. And the line "an ocean of ink washes over the pages" has to relate to Gaster again in some way. Like I keep saying, these ocean and water imageries just all seem to relate to Gaster. And the ink consuming the pages obviously refers to the darkness from the Dark Worlds. This ink has a power to consume the very page itself, consume the media by which the story is told by. Just like how Gaster sort of influences and has control over the video game of Deltarune itself. Which this all could possibly relate to the roaring happening pretty soon. Gerson does state that the tides of fate are drawing close, and with the previous evidence I listed before, the roaring could very well be happening at the end of next chapter. And that's all that I have to say about Gerson for now, and honestly I believe that he holds a key into figuring out the grander direction that the story will take for Deltarune. Moving on to the main story, the Fun Gang chases the night, and where it's able to leave through this grand door in which it locks on the inside. So in turn, we steal the dark fountain within this dark world, and the fountain looks noticeably smaller than how a usual fountain should look. And since we know that this isn't the only dark world within the church, it seems that you can have multiple dark fountains make up one dark world. However, I'm not even going to try to pretend that I understand the full mechanics of dark fountains and how they function, because to me right now it seems like there's a lot more information about dark fountains and their mechanics that will most likely come up in a later chapter, and we simply right now just don't have enough information to make any reasonable conclusions. Anyway, we're back in the light world, and we find out that Gerson Boom in the dark world was created from a hammer covered in his dust, along with a photo of him inside of a glass container in Alvin's office. And this sort of puts in perspective of Alvin's weird dialogue in chapter 2, where he asks if it's right for this hammer to, before getting cut off. To me, this sort of implies that Alvin probably was trying to find a way to revive his father, most likely in an attempt with a dark fountain, hence why the container containing his dust is with inside his office and not buried underground where it should be. But this confirms that it is possible to revive monsters inside of a dark world under specific circumstances. And I heard the community give these unique Darkner-Lightner hybrids the name of Dustners, and is what I'll be referring to them throughout this video. After learning all this, Susie has an idea to try to get into the door that the knight locked, and she thinks that she can get the code from the old man by opening up another dark fountain. So Susie takes Kris's knife, stabs it into the ground, and we're able to finally explore a dark fountain created by Susie. Everything in Susie's dark world is just sort of off, especially compared to the previous dark world that we were just in. The spires in the background are tilted in a much wilder manner than the previous dark world. The piano itself instead moves instead of the blocks that they usually should control. The Darkners that were stone previously are now active, and the active ones are now turned to stone. The colors within this dark world that not only affects the darkners, but also the lighteners are slightly off of their hue. And the perspective of this dark world is sort of flipped on its own head. Like you're able to walk on bookshelves, or you can walk upside down in general. Ralsei said that every dark world is different, but this to me seems a little extreme. Because even in Kris's dark world, we still have the correct colors for the lighteners that explore it. And the structures and buildings found within are not warped like how they are with Susie's. So Susie creating a dark world could possibly mean that it's not within the prophecy, or that there's some deeper meaning going on here and why Susie's dark world is so different in comparison to all the others. But within this dark world, there's one room that intrigues me, a long hallway with multiple darkners that you can speak to. And yes, I know that there's an egg within this room, but like I said, that'll be saved for a later section. What I want to note is that their dialogue specifically is interesting. One says, "What do you call a man with one eye?" Another says, "Why does the angel make its cry?" A third one says, "Who will call the girl who snows?" And the last one says, "I don't know." I don't know. A man with one eye could be referring to Gerson, since he has one eye permanently closed, but another interpretation that I can see is that it's referring to the man behind the tree. I don't know, just the use of man, and that the fact that this room is where you get access to the egg room of chapter 4 in the first place, it just sort of gives me a gut feeling that these questions have to relate to the Eggman in some way. Perhaps this Eggman's true identity, his appearance, has him only having one eye. But the line, "Who will call a girl who snows?" has to refer to Noelle. And this could be a direct reference to the Snowgrave route, how at the end of chapter 2, we the player call out to Noelle to kill Spamton. And lastly, why does the angel make its cry? This line really does stump me, and I don't really have a good answer because we still have a lot of imagery for both player angel and Noelle angel. Though I will say at this moment, I'm leaning more towards player angel, but I don't really know what can make the player cry because we're so many different people all playing the same game. After exploring for a little bit, we get to Gerson's study, and the save point reads, "The fire has run empty. In its place, a stale glow which offers no warmth." I don't think this tidbit is super important to the lore, but I do find it interesting that this is one of the few save points that doesn't have the flavor text related to some sort of power. Susie and Kris later on chase down what they believe to be Gerson and start a battle with him. However, this was only a mere statue. Ralsei tells us that in order for a dark world to create a Dustner based upon the memories of a loved one, it could only appear in a very specific darkness. That bringing Gerson to Castletown won't bring him to life either. This means that in order for a Dustner to exist within a dark world, I assume that the creator of the fountain must have strong memories of when that monster was alive, which is why Susie wasn't able to bring Gerson to life in her dark world. She only knew him when he was a Dustner, never when he was actually alive. That means that the Roaring Knight has to have had strong memories of Gerson from when he was alive. Alright, so let's bring up two options for why Castletown wouldn't bring back Gerson. One, and probably the most likely answer, is that Castletown is made of pure darkness and has unique properties in comparison to every other dark world, hence why Gerson won't be brought back. Or the second option that helps to paint a more intriguing story is that the creator of the Castletown Dark Fountain didn't have strong memories of Gerson from when he was alive, hence why he won't be able to be brought back as a Dustner inside of Castletown, which means that the Supply Closet Dark World was not created by the Knight. But that is all just up to interpretation. After this encounter with the statue, we're able to get the code from the fire extinguisher Darkner, because it was written on the back of him, I guess. After sealing Susie's Dark Fountain, we're able to go to the one that the Roaring Knight hid behind. This dark world is basically identical to the one in appearance as the one that we first explored. And an interesting thing is that it seems that every Darkner is now active, most of them not being churned to stone. Continuing the path forward, we're able to catch up to the Knight. However, the Knight tries to stop us on our path. We get an entire sequence where we have to dodge the Knight's blades while having Kris's soul light the way. After Kris has taken enough damage, both Susie and Ralsei jump in and take the brunt force of the attacks, and with everyone's efforts, we're finally able to reach the end and meet up with the Knight. Unfortunately, the Knight has another trick up its sleeve, and it creates a fountain inside of this dark world. This fountain churns the stone immediately and births a Titan, a being that only has the desire to destroy and nothing else. I know as a community, and myself included, we've all sort of speculated what would happen if a fountain was to be created in a dark world, and now we have a definite answer. It seems that when you create a fountain in a dark world, it will birth a titan. The Fun Gang now climbs the titan and tries to find some sort of way to defeat it. But before we can meet with the main titan itself, we are instead stopped by the titan spawn. The titan spawn seems to be the exact same creature that was chasing us all throughout the first part of this dark world, the one where we're covered in complete darkness, in which this creature has a red glow to them. This, however, is very, very interesting because titan spawn are being created without the titan itself being birthed yet. So I think this adds to the pile of evidence that the roaring is gonna happen very, very soon, and that the dark worlds themselves just being opened up is what inches us closer to the roaring. The last thing of note with these titan spawns is that if you choose to attack them, they will use the death animation in Deltarune, which before chapter 4 we could only see by debugging and exploiting the game, a death animation that was used when you would use Snowgrave on a regular Darkner. After defeating the spawn, we're able to fight the titan itself, and it makes a grand appearance. What's interesting about this entrance is that the white silhouette that we see before the titan fades in is a completely different shape in comparison to the titan's body that we actually fight against. And I doubt that I'm alone when I say that the first time I saw this silhouette, I immediately thought it was Gaster. The silhouette itself looks super detailed, almost like a photorealistic image, which could sort of tie into how Gaster is able to connect to our real world. But I don't believe this is actually Gaster himself, and is just showing a connection between Gaster and the amount of power that he has over the game of Deltarune, that he has a strong connection to the Titans, beings made of pure darkness that only want to see destruction. The actual titan itself has these angel-like wings and has a face that looks like a save point. In hindsight, it seems that the Switch 2 trailer of Deltarune, this final animation, was hinting at this titan encounter all along and not the angel. But after fighting the titan as hard as we could, it seems that it regenerates all the damage that it received, and everything seems like it is all at a loss, that we can't proceed forward. However, the GOAT, the G, appears. Gerson, boom, and smashes the titan with a single hammer. This gives Kris and Susie the perfect opportunity to dive inside of the titan and seal it from the inside. This interaction being the first time that Susie has gotten a good look of Kris's soul. But this soul is insanely powerful. It's able to emit a light that is able to defeat titan spawn, titans, seal fountains, and boost the power of our teammates dramatically. This power is almost unnatural in a way, which could be further evidence for player angel theory, since the angel itself would need to be a powerful being. Everything seems to settle down. We have beaten the titan. However, Susie wants to go up ahead to try to see if she can find the old man, since she's worried about him. But Ralsei is immediately freaked out by this. He's been trying to get ahead of us the entire time during this chapter. Hence why he tried to leave us when we try to close our eyes to imagine Susie, and why he persists and insists that he needs to go ahead during Susie's dark fountain. It was all trying to stop Susie from seeing the end of the prophecy. So let's talk about that prophecy and the different glass panels that appear within each of these dark fountains. And I'll go over every single panel within the game, but I want to only bring my thoughts and analysis to the ones that I think are interesting. So for the first dark world, the prophecy, which whispers among the shadows, the legend of this world, Deltarune, a world bask in purest light. Beneath it grew eternal night. If fountains freed, the roaring cries, and titans shaped from darkened eyes. The light and dark both burning dire, a countdown to the earth's expire. Below on hopes and dreams they send 3 heroes at world's end. The pointy-headed will say toothpaste and then boy. This panel itself is not really lore relevant, but as Susie notes, it seems that the prophecy itself is a super detailed one that seems to predict the future, and ones that the characters cannot change. It seems that they are destined to follow this prophecy to a T, which just makes me ask the question again, how much do the Darkners actually know about the prophecy? So obviously the objects have to have some extent of the prophecy, since the Lightners, the ones that use these objects, have a religion based upon it. But this would mean that the Darkners wouldn't have all the pieces like how the Lightners do. However, it seems that Lancer in chapter 1 is able to recognize Kris, Susie, and Ralsei as the prophetic heroes, something that the Lightners don't know about. And this is even shared with the Chapter 4 Darkners, how they don't recognize that Susie, Kris, and Ralsei are the heroes until at the very end of the Dark World. So why does Lancer know so much about the prophecy, even though some other Darkners just have no idea who the actual heroes are? But we need to move on. Jockington grows the beard. Honestly, this is probably just a joke panel, and I don't even know if Jockington will honestly appear in a Dark World anymore, but it mostly just seems to be a reference to that FanGamer live stream, and I don't think it's super important. The Knight, which makes with blackened knife, shall duel with heroes, strife by strife. So 2 things about this panel. Firstly, the hands of the knight in this panel don't have the signature holes on them, which is an interesting detail to leave out. Secondly, the knight is shown to us to now be a part of this prophecy, an important detail that Ralsei seemed to have left out of his version of the prophecy. Could this mean that the knight's actual identity and them just existing in general could be something that could dissuade both Kris and Susie from actually wanting to go along and fulfill the prophecy and become heroes? The Queen's chariot cannot be stopped. From the imagery, I assume that this is supposed to represent Queen's car, but Queen's car actually does stop in Chapter 2. If Queen's car never stopped, that means we would have never gotten the first Spamton encounter in the Cyber City. And for Susie's Dark World, the panels read, "The Lord of Screens, cleaved red by blade." This is referring to Tenna at the end of Chapter 3. Even if Tenna didn't outright die, he was still cleaved pretty badly. The third hero, the prince alone in deepest dark. This is interesting because Ralsei is still depicted with the same exact hood that we see when we first meet him in the Supply Closet Dark World. And he even has what looks to be fire magic surrounding him. Both of these aspects are things that the current Ralsei don't possess. The first hero, the cage with human soul and parts. This panel is believed to be talking about Kris, but some people have noticed that it seems to be more closely related to the vessel at the start of the game. If we actually ended up playing as the vessel, it quite literally would have been a cage with our human soul made up of various human parts that we would have chosen ourselves. And last was the girl. At last was the girl. This title and image clearly references Susie. The file name for the image being used is even called Rude Buster. The second hero, the girl with hope crossed on her heart. This girl and the image that she appears with is honestly very vague. And with her wielding a sword, it doesn't really 100% match with Susie. Love finds its way to the girl. The girl. Okay, so let's talk about these panels within Susie's Dark World for a moment. I've already stated that Susie's Dark World seems to be distorted and off in some way, and these panels just seem to reinforce that fact, since they seem to be within the wrong order. The original order that the panels should go by is the first hero, the cage, the second hero, the girl, the third hero, the prince, and at last the girl. At last was the girl. This original order sort of suggests that there are actually 4 major characters within the prophecy, the 3 heroes, and then this girl. This last girl has to be Susie. I mean, the image tied to it is called Rude Buster. However, that suggests that the second hero, the girl with hope crossed on her heart, is someone different. And obviously, there's only one clear candidate. This girl has to be Noelle. All these descriptors can also easily fit Noelle. Noelle has hope crossed on her heart. Noelle will eventually find love with Susie. And even though Noelle's main weapon is a ring, she is still able to equip the Jingle Sword if you debug the game. And the fact why this image of the girl doesn't have antlers is easily because Noelle could be hiding them with her hood. So it seems that Susie will have another role to play within the legend, and could tie into why Gerson believes that she holds the Pen of Hope roots. The most popular interpretation for this panel is that it is related to where Kris used to come from before they were adopted into the Dreamer family. It is located in a room that has a connection to the egg room of Chapter 4, which ties heavily into Kris's backstory somewhat, so it would make sense. Gallery. This one appears with the big statues of all the previous Darkners from the first Dark World, and I'm gonna keep it real to you, I have no idea what this could be referring to. It does sort of remind me of the Dog Hall of Fame on the Spamton sweepstake pages that we got a while back. This Hall of Fame was originally going to appear in Chapter 3 for an actual Hall of Fame room, but it ultimately got scrapped, so I don't think that that's what this is hinted at. And finally, the panels for the third Dark World. They'll hear the ring of heaven's call. This ring could be a reference to the thorn ring in the Weird Route, since it's a reference to Jesus' crown of thorns. Either way, this clearly references the angel of legend. They'll see the tail of hell take crawl. Originally, I thought that this was supposed to be a reference to Jevil, but now that I think about it more, that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really look anything like Jevil's tail, and seems to imply a much bigger role than what Jevil has in the game. In the files of the game, it depicts this tail as having a point on the end of it, something that we don't get to see within the actual game itself. The Flower Man trapped in Asylum. This obviously depicts Asgore. However, what's interesting is that the file name for this panel is labeled as Boss 3, and the ones referencing Queen and Tenna are both Boss 1 and 2 respectively. This basically confirms that Asgore will be the ruler of the Flower Shop Dark World and will have an antagonist role similarly to Queen and Tenna. Maybe that area for an extra room could be for Asgore. I don't know, maybe he gets evicted and he has to live in Castletown. But this sort of panel and all the evidence that we looked at before paints a picture for me of what could be going on with Asgore, so allow me to give you a little mini theory surrounding him. Since Asgore seemingly has a black shard or knows what it is, he had to have been in a dark world before, most likely the bunker trying to look for Des. But for whatever reason, Asgore couldn't find Des and told Toriel about this dark world, but she didn't believe him. She thought that he was insane and that he himself was a terrible man, trying to talk about this fantasy-like world to give an excuse as to why he couldn't find Des. And after this encounter, he was removed from the chief of police by the mayor. But the mayor, or Carol, knew somewhat about what Asgore was talking about, and thus tried to keep a watchful eye on Asgore, making him work for the holiday house, cleaning it up, taking care of their plants, as well as being in control of the place that he currently lives at, the flower shop. But Asgore just wants to find the truth, and why he's been trying to gather evidence, using that police skills and knowledge to his advantage. That's why he has a corkboard in his basement, trying to piece together all the information, and why he goes after this black shard, to try to get tangible proof that the Dark Worlds actually exist. And I believe this gives a good explanation as to why Asgore would be removed from the chief of police, why he would be divorced, but still has a good reputation in town. Nobody believes what he says, but they know that he still tried his best, likely losing a little bit of his sanity after trying to search so long for a family friend. And would explain why Asgore himself is trapped in this asylum. He himself knows the truth, but nobody around believes him. But that's sort of the mini theory that I have for Asgore, and we'll finally get to see his interactions, his motivations, and his backstory in Chapter 5, since we're most likely going to his flower shop. The angel banished will finally meet with its desire. The important piece of info about this panel is that the player cannot actually see the image of this prophecy, but the characters in the world can see it. Susie seems a little disturbed by what the angel actually looks like, but Ralsei sort of reassures that this is indeed the angel. I've heard some people say that since the panel isn't shown, the part of where it is pure black would be reflecting upon your screen and monitor, thus showing your face, which heavily points towards player angel theory. Finally, at the end, the last prophecy, the story's end. And then when all hope is lost for the tale, the final tragedy unveils. To save the world, there's only one way. However, the next panel that would seemingly show us this is smashed by Susie, her hand bloodied from the glass, which confirms that Susie does in fact bleed. Does that mean that all monsters bleed? Or is this something that Susie uniquely possesses? It's honestly very tricky to say. The rabbit kid in a hometown asks what it feels like to be made of blood to Kris, but that could just be chalked up to them being a little kid and not knowing how monsters work and how they bleed. But for monsters like Napstablook and Chiron, it seems that their bodies are more magical in a way, since they're able to float above the ground, and in the case of Napstablook is an actual ghost. So does that correlate to the fact that the monsters' bodies are still made of magic like how they are in Undertale? Like I said, it's honestly very hard to say, but I'm leaning more towards the fact that Susie is a special case, which I know we've had some theories in the past say that she's maybe half human, and if that was the case, it would make sense why she wouldn't perfectly fit the monster within the prophecy, since she still has human blood within her. I'm not 100% confident in this belief, but I don't want to pull the trigger and say that every single monster's bleed, so we'll just leave the discussion as it is for now. After Susie punches this panel, she then starts to laugh. She believes that this prophecy is all so stupid. But Ralsei is still terrified. He never wanted Susie to learn this truth. But Susie reassures him that she's not gonna let this happen, that Kris isn't gonna let this happen, that Ralsei wouldn't let it happen either. She puts her hand on his face and says that everything will be alright. But Ralsei knows the truth. He thought that if he was nice to everyone, things could change. But Ralsei, in despair and with blood on his face, looks up to us with pain in his eyes and says that our fate is already decided. This moment really got me as a player, and just sort of cemented the fact that Deltarune is in fact a masterpiece. The game is able to give off this raw emotion that I haven't really experienced in most of the media that I've consumed. But what is this tragedy? The fact that Ralsei has been trying to prevent Susie from seeing this panel, the fact that he's lied to Susie about being a different role than what she was in the prophecy, and the fact that Susie's Dark World's glass panels depict the girl get shattered and broken, and the fact that Ralsei's face is stained with blood after Susie witnessed this forbidden panel. More specifically, Susie's blood. It all just sort of paints a picture that Susie will have to sacrifice herself in order to save the world. And this could clearly fit another role other than hero that this girl with the Rude Buster would have to play. This is why the panel would speak so solemnly about the girl, saying, "And last was the girl, at last was the girl." The girl that sacrifices herself to save the world. After we seal the Dark Fountain, the mood grows dark. Exploring the church, a closet is left closed and could fit a large person inside. When choosing to turn the doorknob, Kris does so, but doesn't open the door, basically confirming that the knight is inside this closet, which confirms that in chapter 2, that closet that was described to fit a large person was describing the hiding place of the knight. But right now it's past midnight and a song plays, The Place Where It Rained, which has a direct correlation to the Undertale song, It's Raining Somewhere Else. This adds major evidence to the idea and theory that Sans originated from the Deltarune world. But finally, we're able to go back to the Dreamer house. But we see Toriel and Sans dancing inside. Toriel was never in the church at all, and was never in any danger from the Dark World. She was just at the house the entire time, drinking with Sans. I know that the community had a very angered reaction towards both Toriel and Sans after seeing the scene, and while I do agree that Toriel is not the best mother, this is clearly not something new and was hinted at before in many different sources of both Undertale and Deltarune. But to me, this is why Deltarune is so great, because this sort of experience that is happening right now is very similar to experiences that people have within their real lives. Situations like this unfortunately happen all the time within our real world, more so than what you would originally think. And to some people, this is their normal and they don't pay it any mind. But to others, it can be seen as very disturbing. And it just further shows that Kris doesn't have the best home life. That what we've seen so far is only scratching the surface of what is actually there. Susie, uncomfortable by this encounter, leaves the house and decides not to sleep over another night. Kris just wants to go to bed, but the noise that Sans and Toriel make keeps them up at night. However, they hear Susie, and she says,
"We aren't gonna let that happen, right?"
Kris, hearing this, tries to climb out of the window of their own room. However, they get a call from the distorted person on the other end of the phone that we've heard earlier, most presumably Carol. The phone says, "Kris, don't forget, Kris. You promised." But the screen slowly fades to black, and the soul is left inside of a birdcage, not knowing of what could happen next. And at the very end, Gaster speaks to us. He says,
"Well done. The halfway mark has been attained. But it is still waiting. How much longer now? My Deltarune."
And all I can say as response is that I sit down, put my hands up in the air, and say peak cinema. Cause what a chapter that chapter 4 actually was. It was a chapter that had everything that I could have ever hoped for, as well as things that I couldn't even expect when it comes to the lore of Deltarune. But I've rambled enough about chapter 4. Let's get into some more focused aspects of these new chapters before we end off the video. The Egg Room. They seem to have gotten a huge upgrade in these new chapters, definitely in comparison to their chapter 1 and 2 counterparts. After seeing these Egg Rooms, they definitely seem to be a lot more lore relevant. So why don't we start with the chapter 3 Egg Room, which is by far the most difficult secret in the game if you're not using a specific guide to help you. The important thing with this sequence is that you're able to get a ticket to nowhere that allows you to go into the Egg Room area. This room that has the egg is very Game Boy-esque and has the light world version of Kris instead of the dark world one. This place is called quote-unquote Man Country and it has these colored rudens that you can speak to. These rudens were hinted at in the main game of Chapter 3, but are 7 copies of Ace playing cards that Kris made to cheat. However, in this actual Man Country, there are only 6 rudens. One says,
Kris never wants to play, boo-hoo. Why don't you photocopy a Kris to play with us?
Another says,
Copies are monochrome, but you colored each of us with care.
and if you interact with the binoculars on the left-hand room, you're able to see a monochrome background of what looks to be some white grass. The ruden after you look through these binoculars will say,
I sense nothing but evil from that place.
okay, so what does this all mean? The monochrome dialogue and imagery seems to be related to the Goners in some way, and the specific dialogue about making a photocopy of Kris and that the copies are always monochrome seems to be referencing the vessel to me. The vessel was literally going to be our protagonist, a copy of what the role of Kris would play in the game. And the thing about that monochrome background in the binoculars that is quote-unquote evil, I believe could somewhat relate to Gaster. Gaster has always been associated with the number 666, so it's most likely that Gaster has some sort of malicious intentions and could be considered quote-unquote evil. And this monochrome look of not only the background, but also copies of characters are associated with the Gaster followers from Undertale. And the fact that the rudens were originally copies themselves, meaning that they were originally monochrome but got colored in by Kris, could be referencing Gaster a lot, seen as the Gaster followers and the Goners are monochrome in nature but can have some color, a color that would have been filled in by Gaster to blend in with the natural world, which would mirror the rudens since their creator gave them color and gave them a purpose of deceiving people to believe that they were actually the real thing. So if you go to the actual Eggman this time, he actually has some dialogue for us, but his speech pattern seems to match that of the secret Valentine's Day card that we got in the newsletter all those years ago, which means that this secret Valentine's Day card was actually just the Eggman. But this dialogue that the Eggman gives us is very intriguing, so let me highlight some key bits and pieces that I want to know. He's quoted to say,
Well, spring changed the summer, and summer changed the cold. And sure enough, I am the forgotten man.
I can see this dialogue having 2 meanings behind it. The first one being a reference to Deltarune's actual release. Since it has taken 3.5 years for us to actually get Deltarune Chapter 3's release, obviously the seasons would change from spring to summer and summer to cold, which could imply some sort of fourth wall information that the Eggman actually has. And second, this could be a reference to the amount of time that Kris actually seemingly forgot this Eggman, since this is a location hidden beneath the couch cushions and seems to have a direct tie to Kris themselves.
You have forgotten me many times before. Even if you meet me, I will be forgotten thereafter. Sometimes I even forget myself.
This man behind the tree seems to be someone that Kris has forgotten, and we know from the mannerisms that this isn't Gaster, and seemingly this man can be found both in the light world in Chapter 2, as well as the dark world with all the egg rooms. It makes me think that maybe there's a chance that this man could be someone from Kris's previous life, before they got adopted into the Dreamer household.
Once upon a time, the whole world looked like this.
Again, this could imply some meta knowledge from the Eggman, since our real world video games used to actually look like this before. However, it only got better and better as technology improved. And if we believe that Gaster is this sort of developer of Deltarune, it would make sense that one of the previous builds of this game would be using older technology, which mirrors our real world and how we've upgraded our tech for our video games.
In any case, this island is the only place left I can talk, but one day, this island will disappear too.
To me, this feels like it's referencing actual video game development and how you'll have older assets and data within a game, and eventually as you progress through game development, you have to get rid of this old data and it'll become scrapped content, which could imply that this man behind the tree that gives us eggs is a scrapped character within the game of Deltarune itself. A character that could have been found in a previous version of the game, but is no longer a part of the main story, a part of the main game. Hence why the only area that they can speak in is this older version of the game. This would explain why everyone forgets who he is and why he can't fully seem to remember it himself.
I'll tell you my schedule. Listen carefully. On Thursday, I go to sell the donuts. On Friday, I toss the leftovers in the dumpster. On Saturday, I let it cool on the windowsill. On Sunday, I harvest the wheat.
This schedule that the Eggman gives us ties into the chapters of Deltarune and each location on where we can meet him in. And with this new knowledge, now we know what day each chapter takes place on. Obviously, donuts refer to the bake sale in chapter 1, which is very close to the area where you find the Eggman. In chapter 2, it's obviously the dumpster area. The one for the windowsill could be referencing the room in chapter 4 with the many windows. And Sunday would obviously be for chapter 5, which adds more evidence to chapter 5 taking place in Asgore's flower shop, since you're harvesting wheat, a plant. After this sort of speech from the Eggman, we're actually able to receive the egg. But before we leave, the Eggman has this to say to us.
Whether 11 hours or 11 years, Deltarune will be waiting. So take your time, wash your face, and get dressed.
After the Eggman says this, Kris switches from their light world design to their dark world design. Again, just another piece of evidence that the Eggman seems to have some sort of meta knowledge about the game, knowing that Kris shouldn't be in their light world design. But the part about Deltarune is waiting is a reference to what the trailer said for Deltarune, as well as what Gaster says at the end of chapter 4. And this seems to tie into the actual game development of the game itself and how the story is being told through chapters. The fact that we have to wait seems to be a narrative piece within the actual game itself. After you leave the egg room, it fades to white, and the sounds of a wave plays before transporting Kris back to the green room. Again, more wave-like imagery found all throughout Deltarune. Even the panels in chapter 4 seem to make sense for having this wave-like texture on them, because technically this is Gaster's story, Gaster's Deltarune. And speaking of chapter 4, let's move on to the chapter 4 egg room. So as I've already said it before, in order to get this egg room, you have to walk in between the room with a bunch of windows and also the secret room that's behind one of the windows. But first, let me talk about the secret room a little bit. In this room, there's a book that you can interact with that says, "And so wept the fallen star, making rivers with its tears. Then slowly from the bitter water, something grew. It looked like glass." I just get major Des vibes from this text. Like, a fallen star could be how Des was sort of a music star within Hometown, with how she tried to put on various shows for her friends and family. Making rivers with its tears, and something growing from bitter water again ties with Gaster's whole water motif. And it's already been heavily theorized that Gaster could have something to do with Des's disappearance, and how she's most likely within the shelter. And the part about it looked like glass can relate to the shadow crystals, which it seems that the Knight and Gaster both have a strong connection to these shadow crystals. Gaster and or the Knight had something to do with Des's disappearance, and in turn it birthed the shadow crystals. We get the roots panel here, which I described earlier, but we also get a dark note on the side that says, "Where the pointed the grow, followed forest the lost children tale would." This dialogue is scrambled up and relates to the second wave of the Spamton sweepstakes pages, and the correct order seems to be lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail. This seems to talk about how Des and Kris would explore the woods, them being lured by this pointed tail. This tail is most likely the one from the panel depicted in earlier, the one with the multiple spears and a hidden point at the end hidden in the files. And the way that this tail sort of lures Kris and Des feels very devilish in nature and reminds me a lot of the story of the devil tempting the first humans with the forbidden fruit of knowledge. This has been already theorized before with Deltarune in the past, but Kris has a lot of relation to apples. The apple shampoo, the eating of the apple in Gerson's tea party, and in Noelle's blog how Kris would eat an apple to sort of taunt Susie in a way. And this forbidden fruit within the Bible was depicted most of the time as an apple. And we have a character within Deltarune and Undertale that is associated a lot with the devil, that being W.D. Gaster. So whether it was Gaster himself or someone that Gaster sent, it's uncertain, but if Gaster is likely involved with this, it most likely means that the area that this devil would lure Kris and Des to was the shelter. But anyway, actually going into the egg room itself, we enter a hospital with a single Rudin at the desk. The Rudin tells us that
the patients are waiting for you.
And by going left, you're able to walk into a room with a tree depicted on its front door. Inside of the room, everything is dark and you're unable to see what's actually in here. But there are still some things you can interact with. You can see a man pointing and nodding at something, a sink to wash your hands with, a person painting a tree, but it's missing the bark of the tree, a person that says, "Are you here for art club?" Right, this is where we draw pictures and don't kill each other. And a blank canvas on which Kris can draw on. Let me read you what it says when you do decide to actually draw on this canvas. Kris picked up a pencil. They began by sketching what they had seen behind the tree. But as they sketched, the line began to err, as if the pencil had lost its way. So they started again, drawing over the lines they had already made. Many times, they would suddenly halt, or the pencil drifted into a new drawing. So they started over and over again. Through many repetitions, their movements became faster and smoother, until without looking, they had completed a sketch in a single, wild line. In the end, as a result of layering the sketches on top of each other, the surface of the canvas was nothing more than a monochrome smear. Next, a tree was painted over it, painted over everything, leaving nothing but a simple still life. After all, there wasn't anything to look at in the room besides a single tree. Kris got up. It seemed the painting was complete, but their hand, smudged with graphite, was still moving, as if to trace some unseen shape. Afterwards, the man disappears, and you can interact with the sink from earlier. It says, you ran water over your hands and dried them. Between your fingers, a faint gray crease glittered stubbornly. You can never wash it all away. If you interact with the Rudin again at the desk, they say
art is therapeutic. Which one of you was the patient anyway?
So this sequence of Kris drawing on an empty canvas was hinted all the way back in the second wave of the Spamton sweepstake pages, where it was described as therapy. And it's pretty obvious that this whole room and sequence represents art therapy. This whole room in general seems to relate to Kris's past, a monochrome smear that they can't completely wash away, and how someone says that we don't kill each other. This sort of harkens back to what I was theorizing about in the sword route analysis before. This could all relate to some sort of shelter experience that Kris had, you know, all the monochrome imagery being heavily tied to Gaster, and how Kris could have potentially killed someone or something, and after the experience with the shelter, Kris would have to go to art therapy to sort of help them cope with this whole experience that they had with losing Des. So who is the one that died and the most likely candidate that Kris could have killed? Right now, all the evidence sort of points towards Des, since that dark deer sprite in the sword route is the only monster that Kris kills on their own without the input of the player. But I do believe that there is more going on here than what we know already, and that there could be another candidate for who Kris could have potentially killed. But that idea that I have sort of deserves its own video talking about it. And while I was doing research for this video, I sort of came to an idea of who the Eggman could potentially be. And I want to bring up the idea that perhaps the Eggman could be Everyman. Both characters, the Eggman and Everyman, are described as man within their names, a very weird similarity that both share. Everyman is a character that I knew about, but I sort of forgot before coming to this idea. He is a character that is in the background of the entire game of Deltarune and has ties to both the Dark World appearing in various attacks as well as the Light World, which fits the description of the Eggman as well, both of them sort of being hidden characters found within the game. Everyman also in Undertale only appears during an attack of an amalgamate, which has a tie to Gaster, since image_friend, which is a character labeled under the device section of Deltarune, which is the same section that has the Goner parts, which is a sequence controlled by Gaster, shares a lap with the amalgamates from Undertale, as well as a body appearance of endogamy. So Everyman could very well have some information about our real world and how video games are developed. And since Everyman is this character that sort of appears randomly everywhere throughout Deltarune, it would also make sense he could have witnessed something from Kris's past. And lastly, wouldn't it make sense for Everyman to be associated heavily with art? Since the only place we can consistently view Everyman in Deltarune is as a graffiti art piece in the back streets of the apartments in Hometown. This is just an interesting thought that I wanted to throw out there, because to me it seems like there's a lot of similarities between the two characters, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were the exact same character. Every man can, well, you know, be every single man, even one that gives us eggs. But those are the egg rooms that we've gotten for chapters 3 and 4. It all has been very interesting interesting and definitely gives us way more insight onto Kris's past and seems to be becoming more and more relevant to the story of the game. But you know, since we're talking about a man that might have been scrapped from the game itself, why don't I talk about the new pieces of code dialogue that we've gotten in chapters 3 and 4, which the community has mostly agreed that this mysterious person talking to us in the code is most likely to be Des. Alright, let me read it to you. What is this place anyway? How did I get here? As if I haven't asked that question a billion times already. I always did have that nightmare, walking into the darkness, with the light shining from the doorway. Then the door slams behind me, and everything goes black. Is this that nightmare? Or was everything else a dream? The next one reads, I'm starting to lose track of the time. Has it been days? Hours? If someone told me it's been years, I might believe them. Before the sun came up, and so many wonderful things happened that made time meaningful. Things like breakfast or late night TV. In this place, I don't eat or drink anymore. I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming. I can't tell if I'm dead or alive. It's just nothing but pitch black silence, except for the noise. This scratching noise I sometimes hear. This sounds crazy, but even though no one can hear me, when I hear that noise, I feel like someone's listening. Anyone, if you're there, thank you. So this new dialogue to me just sort of reinforces the fact that Des has to be the person within this game's code. Des has been implied to be stuck within a dark world, and this person describes their nightmare of them walking into pure darkness, almost like they're entering a dark world. This person also seems to be trapped for a really long time, potentially years, which would match up with Des's timeline of her disappearance. So what is this scratching sound? I've heard that there could be two things. It could either be us, the player, the noise that we make when we look into the actual code of the game, or I've also heard that it could be image_friend. Since friend is a cat and has a tie to Gaster, this scratching could be something that Des is able to hear deep within this sheltered dark world. But that is everything that I have to say about the lines of dialogue in the code and the egg rooms. Both seemingly tie into Gaster in some way and seem to hint at the deeper meta-narrative. So it's going to be very interesting to see what Chapter 5 has to bring next, with this Eggman seemingly collecting the weed. The weird route originally I thought was this route about breaking the game in order to find every single secret. The breaking the game part still sort of holds up now, but it seems like this route is leading towards something else. So let's go into it a little bit. And I'm not going to go over every single change within the weird route in these new chapters, but just the ones that I want to talk about that seem to be important to the lore of Deltarune. First of all, we have the ERAM dialogue from before. It hints to a side of Kris seemingly enjoying a part of the weird route, a part that seems to relate to their past in some way. If you talk to Ralsei about taking Noelle to the festival, he says that it's a bad idea, which could be hinting at Ralsei knowing about the existence of the weird route. In chapter 4, Birdly is actually in the hospital in Hometown and was brought over by Kris outside of our control, most likely during the time they escaped through the bathroom window. But it seems like Birdly is still alive since he is breathing. But this could also be the fallen down state from Undertale, in which monsters are immobile before they die. Usually this happens with monsters that die of old age, but I could also see the devastating Snowgrave spell leading to some sort of fallen down state with Birdly. The spell is described as fatal. In the holiday house, Noelle wants to talk to Kris alone, and Kris puts us inside the gift box so that they can meet with Noelle. If you go into the vents and follow to Noelle's room, we can hear about how Kris actually went to visit Noelle to apologize about everything that happened in the weird route using their true and honest voice. A voice that contrasts the voice that Kris has when being controlled by the player, hence why Noelle believes that the real Kris is finally back. But the player can exploit the dialogue option of Deltarune and using the option proceed to teleport into Noelle's room. Kris tries desperately to stop Noelle from talking anymore about what happened last night, but the soul is able to gain control of Kris once again. Noelle asks who's going to hear them, to which the player responds, me. This in turn changes the room's colors dramatically, makes the decorations on the wall start to spin, and Kris's hair start to stand up. We the player speak in this haunting voice, the one that Noelle heard in chapter 2. And we confirm to her that it did snow yesterday. It was all real. And we take the thorn, the one that represents the thorn ring within the dark world, and put it back into Noelle's hand. This action shatters the screen itself with a deep red and locks us into the weird route making sure that there's no turning back. Afterwards, we see Kris in the bathroom. The vision is blurry as they throw the soul into the trash can and start violently kicking the soul. After Kris puts the soul back in, if you check their HP, it will say 10 instead of the maximum of 20. While walking to the church with Susie, time seems to stand still and the colors distort once again. A blank dialogue box appears with 4 options, 1 in each direction. But afterwards, everything goes back to normal. In the dark world of chapter 4, if you instead think about Noelle while talking to Ralsei, you see a little red dot that moves. You can hear Noelle's voice shaking, saying, "Thank you." The screen then goes a bright red, and Kris falls over, Susie worried about them. When you talk to Ralsei after Susie discovers the last prophecy panel, he says that he wants to believe that it can change, that there isn't just one ending for this fate, but he wonders what a different ending would even be, and says that it might be something even worse. And finally, at the end of the chapter, Kris gets a call from Carol. Just a normal cell phone call. Nothing is distorted about it. She says that Noelle is looking forward to seeing Kris tomorrow at the festival. Kris lies in bed, the phone to their ear, and the chapter fades away, where we get to see the same red dot again, and as the chapter ends, Gaster greets us once more, saying the exact same thing that he said in the normal route. Before I go with the analysis of the weird route, I want to sort of say that I know about the existence of the original animation that played before it got patched out with the weird route, and I want to respect Toby's wishes in changing the weird route animation, because obviously the original one had a different interpretation that people were getting that did not align with the creator's vision. So I am not going to be including that previous animation in any sort of analysis with this section, since it is no longer relevant to the game anymore. Anyway, moving on. The sort of big theory that I sort of get from these new scenes is that it seems like a piece of the soul is now inside of Noelle. And it seems like this piece of the soul could eventually become a full one, the one that the player possesses. And this seems to be a plan by the player to sort of take control of Noelle fully and maybe sort of change who we control in the story from being Kris to Noelle. This act from the player is seemingly something that breaks the game itself. The colors of the game are becoming distorted, and the game itself seems to be breaking heavily with the scene of Susie and Kris walking to the church. If we are to believe that the player is the angel in Deltarune, then seemingly in the weird route, gaining full control of Noelle by having the red soul inside of her could mean that in the weird route, Noelle becomes the angel instead, which would explain all the angel-like imagery for both Noelle and the player. But what's interesting about this is that Gaster doesn't really mind the fact that the weird route is happening. He still gives us the same dialogue at the end of chapter 4. That could mean that Gaster's goal with this game isn't to strictly follow a set path of the prophecy, which could align to the fact that this whole game in general is more so of an experiment to see and observe the player's choices within this world. And since Gaster lets this evil route continue, it means that his morality is not the best, which correlates to the devilish numbers of 666. The last thing that I want to talk about is Carol's call being different than in the regular route. This has caused some people to believe that the distorted person on the phone is someone else other than Carol, and that the weird route sort of confirms this notion. But I think there's a simpler explanation that could explain why this call is so different. It seems that Carol has access to the bunker, and it seems that both her and this phone person would know about the existence of dark worlds. So what if the reason why her call is distorted in one scene and isn't in another is because she isn't in the bunker at the end of the weird route, while in the regular route she is. We already know that dark worlds have an effect on phone calls. It gives off a garbage noise while inside of it, but we still know that phone calls can still be made in the dark world and can be received by other people. Spamton is still able to receive and answer these phone calls even though he's a darkner, since he was getting calls from this mysterious someone, and his phone is actively actively ringing inside of his own shop in chapter 2. And we know in general that phone calls in the dark world and this mysterious someone has a connection to the shelter because of the smile.ogg sound. So it's not too far-fetched to believe that the shelter has a method to communicate with people in and out of the dark worlds. However, it's not exactly the same as a regular phone call, hence why the speech of Carol calling Kris is distorted in chapter 4. It's because she's currently inside of the shelter, and the reason it isn't at the end of the weird route is because she's outside of the shelter, most likely at the holiday house after talking to Noelle. Overall, the weird route is just a more disturbing route in general compared to the genocide route of Undertale. In Undertale, it was a much more simpler evil that you sort of committed, but the weird route in Deltarune is much more complex and thus leads us down a path that has us commit these sins on a more personal level, really giving you that feeling of a pit inside of your stomach, a much more real feeling than what Undertale offered. And I sort of wonder, what is Toby trying to go for with this route? Because at times it seems like the soul has a clear goal in the weird route that we the player just simply don't fully understand at the moment. All some very disturbing things. And it seems like chapter 5, the festival, will be sort of the breaking point of the weird route. The secret bosses of Deltarune have seemingly gotten a way bigger role than what was shown previously, and they help to expand on our perceptions of what a secret boss actually is. It's very interesting in chapter 3 because with our perceptions before, we would have thought that either Tenna or Ram would have fit the bill for who to be a secret boss. Tenna is quite literally a discarded item trying to find his own sense of freedom by following the knight, but still ended up short, very similar to Spamton. And Ram as a character seem to have followed the same mold, literally be an object that didn't belong in their own dark world. But both of those characters didn't receive a shadow crystal and thus did not qualify for a secret boss. But Gerson, a Dustner in chapter 4, was given a shadow crystal, a character that wasn't forgotten and is seemingly the most important item within the dark world, bringing back a beloved and adored monster inside of this dark world. And Gerson doesn't really fit the bill of a character being trapped in some sort of way. And he helps out the Lightners and doesn't deceive them like how the other secret bosses seem to do. Which brings us toward the Knight, the quote-unquote secret boss of chapter 3. The Knight goes against everything in the game for a secret boss, and I believe that that is intentional. Because in chapter 3, this was Kris's Dark Fountain, and it's most likely why no Darkner had a Shadow Crystal in this dark world. So if we wanted to get a Shadow Crystal in chapter 3, instead of us finding a Darkner that will give us a Shadow Crystal, we go to the very source itself and decide to beat the Knight, whose blade seemingly has a shadow crystal embedded in it, or could possibly be made up of shadow crystals. So was the Knight the one giving the shadow crystals all along in each of these dark fountains? To me personally, I feel like that's not the case. Both Gerson and Sham seem to point to the strange person that had been giving the secret bosses the shadow crystals as a different person than the Knight. They use a completely different descriptor of this person. Maybe we were right to assume that it was Gaster all along that had been giving out these shadow crystals and contacting these Darkners, which calls into question, what purpose do the shadow crystals hold? To me at least, they seem to be a way to break the prophecy. Jevil considers himself truly free even though he is trapped in a cage. It's because he's an encounter not fated by the prophecy that holds a shadow crystal. Spamton wanted to gain the power of Neo and obtain the soul from Kris, seemingly to gain enough power to escape this prophecy. However, the only way that we actually interact with Spamton is when the Queen's car stopped, an event that goes against the prophecy, saying that the chariot of the Queen will never be stopped. And in turn, after defeating him, we get a shadow crystal. Defeating the Knight itself seems to be an act that goes off script, something that normally shouldn't happen. Hence why it's the only boss fight that if you lose, you can continue on in the main story. It's like you're expected to lose. And by going off the script, we get a shadow crystal. And Gerson is trying to inspire the Fun Gang, and more specifically Susie, to hold the pen of hope and create a path with this pen that is entirely made by themselves. And after we get the shadow crystal from him, Susie receives the hammer, a terrible weapon that a smith gives her. A weapon donned by someone that isn't one of the prophesized heroes. So going forward, we can assume that characters in the future that are secret bosses will have themes or events that tie into this fact of breaking the prophecy. Alright, the knight, the roaring knight. When I first encountered the knight, it completely blew my mind. And it was unlike anything I've ever seen in Deltarune before, and maybe even something I haven't seen in any game before that I played. The knight is this being that is so powerful. It can seemingly down and swoon anyone that it desires with just a couple of hits. It can morph, shape, and twist its body to whatever shape it desires, not being tied down by a physical form. And its battle theme, Black Knife, seems to contain some motifs that are very interesting. We got Burn in Despair from Azrael Dreamer's fight in Undertale, The Chase, and even Lost Girl. All these motifs just sort of reinforce the fact that the knight has a lot going on with its character and is a perfect piece of music to fit the antagonists that we'll be encountering throughout the entirety of this game. The knight seemingly has a light world form, since it carries Undyne to the shelter, and seemingly a large person is described by the closet dialogue, which the knight is most likely hiding inside of. And this knight is working with our protagonist Kris, and most possibly Carol, since she knows exactly where the next Dark Fountain will be. But who is the knight? Seemingly they have an identity. So far there are a lot of answers in the community, but the two big ones seem to be Carol Knight and Death Knight. I don't plan to go over every single evidence for these two theories specifically. There are already a ton of videos covering both sides of who the knight is, but what I will say is that the knight seemingly has a connection to Gaster. It has white holes in its hands, being a mirror to the Mystery Man sprite from Undertale. The knight's laugh is also the exact same laugh that Friend uses, as well as the amalgamates from Undertale, another connection to Gaster. And the knight as a character, at least I believe, appeared in Toby's fever dream. The mystery and intrigue with the Roaring Knight has made it such a fascinating character for me. Its design, music, and atmosphere have captured a feeling I haven't gotten in a very, very long time, which is why the knight to me is one of my favorite characters within the game, even if they have absolutely no dialogue so far. We have learned so much about Ralsei in these two new chapters. I think that we can all predict that Ralsei was withholding the truth somewhat in chapters 1 and 2 about how much he actually knew what was going on in the story, but now we get a much clearer picture of that knowledge that Ralsei holds. The sheer amount of knowledge of the future and how he can't do anything about it sort of shakes him to his core. He never asked to get this much knowledge, and as such he views himself as nothing but a tool, a guide to get to the end of the game. But his idea of him not being real is challenged every single chapter as he has more time to spend with Susie and Kris. And that's why for Ralsei it hurts. It hurts to believe that you're not supposed to have feelings, that you're not supposed to get attached to the people that you care about, but the people around you, the ones that you truly care about and the ones that care about you back, still treat you with so much kindness, so much humanity. But Ralsei is realizing that he is real. He does matter, and that he wants to be friends with the people that he's closest with. And that's why Ralsei wants to prevent this tragedy. A tragedy that will most likely end up in one of his friends getting severely hurt, something that he cannot heal. Which is why he was trying to be nice to everyone in chapter 1, hoping that if he's good to those that he meets in these dark worlds, they will be good to him back and try to save him and his friends when they need it the most, to prevent this tragedy. And puts a whole new perspective on Ralsei in the previous two chapters. And I believe he was trying to tell Kris in secret, outside of the player's perspective, of why they need to be nice to everyone and the danger that lies ahead for one of their friends. This is why he freaks out in the weird route of chapter 2, because not knowing of what could happen to Susie could mean that he's unprepared for the future, and is why he begs and pleads in chapter 4 to try to go on ahead, trying to prevent his friends from seeing the truth, because he believes that if someone should hurt, it should be him and not the ones that he cares about. But Ralsei is learning that he doesn't have to take this burden on alone. He can share it with his friends, and together they can try to find a way to stop this prophecy, to change fate and make a happy ending. So Kris. Kris, in my opinion, is the greatest silent protagonist in gaming. As the game continues, we get more and more information about them, which just further separates the player from Kris themselves. Kris is working with the knight and Carol to go into these dark fountains, all to fulfill a promise that they seemingly made in the past, a promise that relates to the Red Soul. and is why they allow the soul to take control of them. However, seemingly at every opportunity that they can get, they remove the soul, whether this be to fulfill a greater plan, undo some of the choices that the player made, or to simply enjoy a nice break and have their freedom again. And now we know that Kris has a past filled with sorrow and tragedy, an experience with a shelter that has changed their life forever. This experience made them lose Des, and was likely a reason as to why Kris made this promise in the first place. But as they keep moving on through these dark worlds, the player's desire to find each and every secret keeps digging up Kris's past. They get taunted by how their knife grows dull, and the Eggman in their rooms are a constant reminder of Kris of this past. And even though Kris is trying to hide the fact that they are working with the big antagonist of the game, the Knight, it seems that the bonds that they made on this journey are genuine, having a real connection for Susie and a growing empathy for Ralsei. However, it's uncertain how those bonds will hold up now. It could completely shake them, or perhaps even break them, once it's revealed that Kris is working with the Knight. How they're being controlled by a completely different entity, one that has been interacting with these friends for them. But we'll just have to see what will happen when Kris's truth is finally revealed. Susie, for me, has to have been the MVP for these new chapters. She was able to shine through with this game with her just genuine emotions all throughout, and it helped me to resonate with her and her struggles and her emotions, and in turn made her my favorite Lightner in the game so far. Susie's earnesty for her friends is so sincere. She doesn't want to see Ralsei devalue himself as a person, even though she knows that Ralsei is a Darkener. He can never come into the light world, and Susie always has Kris's back, making an earnest attempt to make them feel special and make them feel valued as a person. And it's shown to us many times that Susie finally feels important, feels like she has a role to play in her own life. The story that she tells about the piano in her old town really helps to exemplify this. She had never played the piano before, but wanted to give it a try. But because of the people around her, she was pressured to get up and leave. She never had a chance to improve because she didn't fit the mold of what a piano player looked like, and that's why she went back to smash the piano, a rage that has been building up inside of her, most likely throughout her entire life. That's why she decided to fit the mold that everyone gave to her, that being the mean, the scary girl, the bully. But that wasn't truly her. Susie deep down is the most caring person in the game, able to have a strong connection to the people around her, allow for her friends to be heard by her, honestly and truthfully, and in turn trying to do her best to tell them that everything is going to be alright, that they have worth, something that Susie was never told in her own past. Seemingly, however, everything is looking up for Susie. She was able to make a best friend with Kris, able to connect and empathize with each and every Darkener in every single Dark World, able to inspire Ralsei to become his own person, able to find a genuine romance with Noelle, able to find a real mentor with Gerson, and the fact that she's finally going to be a hero that the world needs, a purpose that she never had. The prophecy, however, isn't that simple. Tragedy will strike, blood will be shed, and you cannot escape the fate, the one foretold by time and space. So, Chapter 5 of Deltarune is set to release in 2026, the shortest amount of time that we'll have to wait for a new chapter. However, I've been seeing a lot of discourse and discussion about these new chapters and what it relates to the themes of the overall game as a whole and what to expect next. Many people seem to have the interpretation that we, the players, are inherently bad for playing the game itself because we are forcibly controlling Kris, but I don't believe that this angle is entirely what Toby Fox is trying to convey. I've heard people say very similar things about Undertale when that released, that the game was trying to make the player feel bad for just interacting with the game in general, but that completely misses the point of Undertale. Undertale as a story is a reactive narrative. That's the whole point of the game. The characters will react realistically to the player's actions within the game, and is why Undertale was such a revolutionary game when it came out, because this depiction of realistic reactions to a player's choice place leads to great and impactful storytelling. And that is sort of the direction that Deltarune is taking. Kris is just realistically reacting to having another being control them. In a regular route, I don't think Kris hates us. And I know that a majority of us don't hate Kris. When I first heard Kris play the piano in chapter 4, my initial reaction and impression was to say, wow, Kris, you're really good at playing the piano. And I think that's what this scene is trying to convey. An appreciation for Kris as their own person, that they have their own unique talents and creativity that is inspiring. And throughout the entire game of Deltarune, the best experience that you'll get is when you decide to become friends with everyone. And I believe that Kris is no exception. We want to be able to tell Kris that their piano skills are amazing. We don't want to control them forever. So no, we're not bad for playing the game of Deltarune. It's just that right now, Kris is reacting realistically to the player, and we need to find a way to make a good outcome for everyone involved in the story, which ties into my next point. I've seen a lot of debate and discourse about what Deltarune will be as a game. Will it have a set good ending where everything works out, or will the future be dark and have a bad ending for our characters? Some people have said it in their mind that Toby Fox won't have any sort of character death or any event that can lead to that level of sadness within the main route of the story. But this seems to contradict the game itself. Something bad will happen. Supposedly something will happen to Undyne. Her sacrifice is next week, and Rudy's condition isn't getting any better. Each and every chapter that we've gotten has only gotten more darker and more realistic in tone. So can you really blame people for expecting that the game will have a bad ending? I certainly don't. But as we also know, this tale is one of hopes and dreams. Even if this tragedy will occur and that some characters are fated to die, it doesn't mean that the story can't have a hopeful ending. Think of all the most impactful stories that you know about. Ones that just scream a message about hope, perseverance, and determination. Isn't what makes those stories and their messages so powerful is because they have some sort of tragedy within them, that no matter the hardships that the protagonists have to face, they are still able to get up and create a better future. Like Gerson said, what taints a good story is predictability, and that goes both ways. You need some hardships in a story to make it good, but you also can't have everything be predictably bad either. So that brings us to a question. How will the story end? What message will Deltarune try to tell? The format that Deltarune is being told in is that of a chapter by chapter story. This has to have ties to the meaning and theming of the game. We are constantly told in the game that Deltarune is waiting, and the fact that we have to wait must mean something important. Usually Toby wouldn't release a game in this format. He released Undertale as a full game when it was finished, and he constantly tells us in newsletters and tweets that it pains him so much to have to wait to release Deltarune. All of these facts tells me that Deltarune is telling its story in chapters because it will not have a traditional ending for when you get to either chapter 7 or chapter 6. The chapter will end, but there will always be something more, another chapter, an ending that you can't reach, which is why it is expected of the player to continue the story, to finish this ending. Like Gerson said, the story itself consumed the author, and the story was never finished. The pen was always lying there for the next generation, for the youth to pick it up, which is why I believe that Deltarune will have 3 main paths to take: a standard route following the prophecy, a weird route, and a hopeful route. The standard and the weird route will always have a final chapter lingering in the game itself, a route with an ending you can't reach. But if your love for the characters and the story are strong enough, you're able to have enough determination, enough power, enough love to find that true ending. Will you be able to find the means necessary to reach the final chapter and be able to write the truth, create that final chapter with the pen of hope that you hold? After all these years of waiting, all the time that you invested in the game, will you finally be able to finish the story of Deltarune? And after so many years of the game being out, I think I finally understand what hyperlink block means and what is the power that we are constantly told about throughout the game. And to me, I believe that that word is love. The characters in this game help to exemplify the positive aspects of love. Susie's love for her friends, Ralsei discovering a love for himself, Noelle's romantic love for Susie, Asgore's love for his family that keeps him moving forward, Gerson's love for storytelling, and Kris's love of creativity. And for our antagonists of the game, we get to see the darker aspects of love, when a love for a certain thing gets taken too far. King's love for Darkners, Jevel's love of freedom, Queen's love of Lightners, Spamton's love of power, Tenna's love of the past, the Knight's love for creation, and Gaster's love of experimentation. We as players get to choose the type of love that we have for Deltarune. Do we choose to love the journey, the experience, the characters that we have grown fond of, or do we choose to love the control, the power, the necessity for us that this world brings? That choice, that story, and the medium that we experience it through is all just a part of Toby Fox's love of video games. This love helped to birth the game of Deltarune, one that has a deep love in the many inspirations that Toby has, which in turn helped to inspire us, we as a community, to create our own stories, our own music, our own art, and help to inspire our own theories about a game that we love so dearly. And to me, it seems like some people have lost sight of the reason why people theorize in the first place. The main purpose of theorizing is not to be right about the game of Deltarune and the direction that it takes. It is definitely a cool bonus if your theory ends up being right, but that should never be the main point of why you should theorize. We theorize because it is fun, and it is a way to show off our creativity for something that we truly love. The best theories out there, the ones that will resonate with many different people, are the ones that are able to tell a compelling narrative, a narrative that is enhanced by evidence found within the game. Think about all the most compelling theories that you might have heard. Woody theory, Seven Knights, Oblivion theory, chess theory, and many, many more. They are all fun, compelling narratives backed up by in-game evidence. Even if they ended up not being 100% true, they still are fun to think about, fun to talk about. And that's partially why I wanted to make this video, to compile the most important lore bits to me and come up with my own little mini theories along the way to help spark people's creativity, to get their own ideas about the game. I want people to come up with the most wackiest, compelling, and fun ideas to just talk about. And this video was also made to help inspire myself, because while gathering all the details for this video, I think I might have came up with a crazy idea, but one that I believe tells a compelling story within the game of Deltarune. So if you liked what I had to say in this video, make sure to hit that like. And if you want to see more from me, make sure to hit that subscribe. And if you want to be notified when that future video might come out, make sure to hit that bell, because I will be working on a video and a theory all about the Roaring